Chapter 16 of The Story of the Atlantic Telegraph. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Atlantic Telegraph by Henry M. Field. Chapter 16 Victory at Last. Part 1. In these pages we have led our readers through 12 long years, and have had to tell many a tale of disaster and defeat. It is now our privilege to tell of triumphant success. Victory has come at last, but not by the chance of fortune, but by the utmost efforts of man, by the union of science and skill with indomitable perseverance. The failure of the last year was a sad disappointment, but so far from damping the courage of those embarked in the enterprise, it only roused them to a more gigantic effort. They were now to prepare for a fifth expedition. In this they set themselves to anticipate every possible emergency, and to combine the elements of success so as to render failure impossible. The Great Eastern herself, which they had come to regard with a kind of fondness, a feeling of affection and pride, as the ark that was to bear their fortunes across the deep, was made ready for her crowning achievement. For months Captain Anderson and Mr. Halpin, his chief officer, worked day and night to get her into perfect trim. She had become sadly fouled in her many voyages. As she swam the seas, 1,000 things clung to her as to a floating island, till her hull was encrusted with mussels and barnacles 2 feet thick, and long seaweed flaunted from her sides. Like a brave old war horse, long neglected, she needed a thorough grooming, to have her hair combed and her limbs well rubbed down, to fit her to take the field. But it was not an easy matter to get under the huge creature, to give her such a dressing. Yet Captain Anderson was equal to the emergency. He contrived a simple instrument by which every part of her bottom was raked and scrubbed. Getting rid of this rough, shapeless mass would make her feel easy and comfortable at sea, and add at least not an hour to her speed. The boilers, too, were thoroughly cleansed and repaired in every part, and the paddle engines were so arranged that in 5 minutes they could be disconnected, so that by going ahead with one and backing with the other, the ship could be held perfectly at rest or be turned around in her own length, a very important matter when they should come to fish in deep waters for the broken end of the cable. To prepare for this, she was armed with chains and ropes and irons of the most formidable kind. For grappling the cable, she took on board 20 miles of rope, which would bear a strain of 30 tons, probably the largest fishing line used since the days of Noah. The cable was manufactured at the rate of 20 miles a day, and as fast as delivered and found perfect, was coiled on board. And now the electricians tried their skill to outdo all they had done before. As Captain Anderson observed, it seemed as if never had so much brain power been concentrated on the problem of success. The cable itself furnished the grandest subject of experiment. As every week added more than 100 miles to its length, there was constant opportunity to try the electric current on longer distances and with new conditions. The results obtained showed the rapid and marvelous progress of electrical science. Said the Times: "The science of making, testing, and laying cables has so much improved that an undetected fault in an insulated wire has now become literally impossible, while so much are the instruments for signaling improved that not only can a slight fault be disregarded if necessary, but it is even easy to work through a submarine wire with a foot of its copper conductor stripped and bare to the water. This latter result, astonishing as it may appear, has actually been achieved for some days past with the whole Atlantic cable on board the Great Eastern. Out of a length of more than 1,700 miles, a coil has been taken from the center, the copper conductor stripped clean of its insulation for a foot in length, and in this condition lowered over the vessel's side till it rested on the ground. Yet through this the clearest signals have been sent, so clear indeed as at one time to raise the question whether it would be not worth while to grapple for the first old Atlantic cable ever laid, and with these new instruments working gently through it for a year or so, at least make it pay cost." As other things were on the same gigantic cable, by the time the big ship had her cargo and stores on board she was well laden. Of the cable alone there were 2,400 miles, coiled in 3 immense tanks as the year before. Of this 748 miles were a part of the cable of the last expedition. The tanks alone, with the water in them, weighed over 1,000 tons, and the cable which they held 4,000 tons more. Besides which she had to carry 8,500 tons of coal and 500 tons of telegraph stores, making 14,000 tons, besides engine, rigging, etc., which made nearly as much more. So enormous was the burden, that it was thought prudent not to take on board all her coal before she left the Medway, especially as the channel was winding and shallow. It was therefore arranged that about a third of her coal should be taken in at Berehaven, on the southwest coast of Ireland. With this exception, her lading was complete. The time for departure had been fixed for the last day of June, and so admirable had been the arrangements, and such the diligence of all concerned, that exactly at the hour of noon she loosened from her moorings and began to move. It was well that she had not on board her whole cargo, for as it was she drew nearly 32 feet. Never had any keel pressed so deep in those waters. It required skilful handling to get her safely to the sea. Gently and softly she floated down, over bars where she almost grazed the sand, where but a few inches lifted her enormous hull above the river's bed. But at length the rising tide bears her safely over, and she is afloat in the deeper waters of the Channel. At first the sea did not give her a very gracious welcome. The wind was dead ahead, and the waves dashed furiously against her. But she kept steadily on, tossing their spray on high, as if they had struck against the rocks of Eddystone lighthouse. In 4 or 5 days she had passed down the Irish coast, and was quietly anchored in the harbor of Berehaven, where she was soon joined by the other vessels of the squadron. The Telegraph fleet was not the same as that of the last year. The government could spare but a single ship, but the Terrible, which had accompanied the Great Eastern on the former expedition, was still there to represent the majesty of England. The William Corry, a vessel of 2,000 tons, bore the ponderous shore end, which was to be laid out 30 miles from the Irish coast, while the Albany and the Medway were ships chartered by the Company. The latter carried several hundred miles of the last year's cable, besides one of heavier proportions, 90 miles long, to be stretched across the mouth of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. While the Great Eastern remained at Berehaven to take in her final stores of coal, the William Corry proceeded around the coast to Valentia to lay the shore end. She arrived up the harbor on the morning of Saturday, the 7th of July, and immediately began to prepare for her heavy task. This shore end was of tremendous size, weighing 20 tons to the mile. It was by far the strongest wire cable ever made, and in short lengths was stiff as an iron bar. As the year before, the cable was to be brought off on a bridge of boats reaching from the ship to the foot of the cliff. All the fishermen's boats were gathered from along the shore, while H.M.S. Raccoon, which was guarding that part of the coast, sent up her boats to help, so that as they all mustered in line, there were 40 of them, making a long pontoon bridge. An Irish boatman with eager looks and strong hands was standing along the line, to grasp the ponderous chain. All went well, and by 1 o'clock the cable was landed, and its end brought up the cliff to the station. The signals were found to be perfect, and the William Corry then slowly drew off to sea, unlimbering her stiff shore end till she had cast over the whole 30 miles. At 3 o'clock next morning she telegraphed through the cable that her work was done, and she had buoyed the end in water 100 fathoms deep. Describing the scene, the correspondent on the London News says: "In its leading features it presented a striking difference to the ceremony of last year. Earnest gravity and a deep-seated determination to repress all show of the enthusiasm of which everybody was full was very manifest. The excitement was below, instead of above, the surface. Speech-making, hurrahing, public congratulations, and vaunts of confidence were, as it seemed, avoided as if on purpose. There was nothing far more touching in the quiet and reverent solemnity of the spectators yesterday than in the slight boisterous joviality of the peasantry last year. Nothing could prevent the scene being intensely dramatic, but the prevailing tone of the drama was serious instead of comic and triumphant. The old crones in tattered garments, who cowered together, dudheen in mouth, their gaudy colored shawls tightly drawn over head and under the chin; the barefooted boys and girls, who by long practice walked over sharp and jagged rocks, which cut up boots and shoes with perfect impunity; the men at work uncovering the trench, and winding in a single file up and down the hazardous path cut by the cablemen in the otherwise inaccessible rock; the patches of bright color furnished by the red petticoats and cloaks; the ragged garments, only kept from falling to pieces by bits of string and tape; the good old parish priest, who exercises mild and gentle spiritual sway over the loving subjects of whom the ever popular Knights of Kerry is the temporal head, looking on benignly from his car; the bright eyes, supple figures, and innocent faces of the peasant lasses, and the earnestly hopeful expression of all, made up a picture impossible to describe with justice. Add to this the startling abruptness with which the tremendous cliffs stand flush out of the water, the alternations of bright wild flowers and patches of verdure with the most desolate barrenness, the mountain sheep indifferently cropping the short, sweet grass, and the undercurrent of consciousness of the mighty interests at stake, and few scenes will seem more important and interesting than that of yesterday. As the ships are now ready for sea, and all who are to embark have come on board, we may look about us at the personnel of the expedition. Who are here? We recognize many old familiar faces that we have seen in former campaigns, gallant men who have had so many a sea fight in this peaceful war. First the eye seeks the tall form of Captain Anderson. There he is, modest and grave, a few words, but seeing everything, watching everything, and ruling everything with a quiet power. And there is his second officer, Mr. Halpin, who keeps a sharp lookout after the crew, to see that every man does his duty. While he thus keeps watch of all on board, Staff Commander Moriarty, R.N., comes on deck, with instruments in hand, to look after the heavenly bodies, and reckon the ship's latitude and longitude. This is an old veteran in the service, who has been on all the expeditions, and it would be quite improper, even if it were possible, for a cable to be laid across the Atlantic without his presence and aid. But here comes Mr. Canning, the engineer, whose deep sea soundings the last year were on a scale of such magnitude, and who, if he cannot well dive deeper, means to pull stronger the next time. That slight form yonder is Professor Thomson, of Glasgow, a man who in his knowledge of the subtle element to be brought into play, and the enthusiasm he brings to its study, is the very genius of electrical science. And this is Mr. Varley, who seems to have the lightning in his fingers, and to whom the world owes some marvellous discoveries of the laws of electricity. Mr. Willoughby Smith, a worthy associate in these studies and discoveries, goes out on the ship as electrician. And here is Mr. Glass, the managing director of the Telegraph Construction and Maintenance Company, which is undertaken by contract to manufacture this cable and lay it safely across the ocean; and Mr. Gooch, chairman of the company that owns the Great Eastern, two gentlemen to whom the Atlantic Telegraph is under the greatest obligation; and since it was they who, 6 months before, when the project seemed in danger of being given up or postponed for years, took Mr. Field by the hand and cheered him on to a last effort. Blessings on their hearts of oak! Mr. Gooch accompanies the ship, while Mr. Glass, keeping Mr. Varley at his side as electrician, remains on shore to receive reports of the daily progress of the expedition, and to issue his orders. What a post of observation was that telegraph house on the cliffs of Valentia! It commanded a far broader horizon than the top of Fiesole, from which Galileo looked down on the valley of the Arno, and up at the stars. Was there ever a naval commander favored with a power of vision that could sweep the boundless sea? What would Nelson have said, if he had had a spy glass with which he could watch ships in action 2,000 miles away, and issued his orders to a fleet on the other side of the ocean? With such a long range he might almost have fought the battle of the Nile from his home in England. Standing on such a spot, and surrounded by such men, representing the capital, the science, and the skill of England, with all those gallant ships in sight, one's heart might well beat high. But there were other reflections that saddened the hour, and caused some at least to look once more on the rocks of Valentia with deep emotion. Some of their old companions in arms had fallen out of the ranks, while the battle was not yet won. Brett, Mr. Field's first friend in England, was in his grave. Beyond the Atlantic, Captains Hudson and Berryman slept the sleep that knows no waking. They were not forgotten by their survivors, who mourned that those who had toiled with them in former days were not here to share their triumph. The feeling, therefore, of many on this occasion was not one elate with pride and hope, but subdued by serious thoughts and tender memories. In harmony with this feeling, and with the great work which they were about to undertake, it was proposed that before the expedition sailed they should hold a solemn religious service. Was there ever a fitter place or a fitter hour for prayer than here, in the presence of the great sea, to which they were about to commit their lives and their precious trust? The first expedition ever sent forth had been consecrated by prayer. On that very spot, 9 years before, all heads were uncovered and all forms bent low, at the solemn words of supplication; and there had the Earl of Carlisle, since gone to his honored grave, cheered them on with high religious hopes, describing the ships which were sent forth on such a mission, as "beautiful upon the waters, as were the feet upon the mountains of them that publish the gospel of peace." In such a spirit, two of the directors, Mr. Bevan of London and Mr. Bewley of Dublin, sent invitations to a number of persons to meet at Valentia, as the expedition was about to sail, and commend it to the favor of Almighty God. Captain Anderson had greatly desired to be with them at this parting service, but the ships were at Berehaven, and they were just embarking for sea. But though the officers could not be present, a large company came together. Said an Irish paper, "Men of different religious denomination, and of various professions in life, Irishmen, Englishmen, and Scotchmen, joined in such a service as has never been held in this island." It was a scene long to be remembered, as they bowed together before the God and Father of all. Their brethren, who were about to go down to the sea in ships, felt their dependence on a higher power. Their preparations were complete. All that man could do was done. They had exhausted every resource of science and skill. The issue now remained with Him who controls the winds and waves. Therefore was it most fit that, at the very moment of embarking, those who remained behind should, as it were, kneel upon the cliff, and with outstretched hands commit them to Him who alone spreadeth out the heavens and ruleth the raging of the sea. In all this there is something of antique stamp, something which makes us think of the sublime men of an earlier and better time, of the Pilgrim Fathers kneeling on the deck of their little ship at Leyden as they were about to seek a refuge and a home in the forests of the New World, and of Columbus and his companions celebrating a solemn service before their departure from Spain. And so with labor and with prayer did this great expedition go forth once more from the shores of Ireland, bearing the hopes of science and of civilization, with courage and skill looking out from the bow across the stormy waters, and a religious faith, like that of Columbus, standing at the helm. On Friday morning, the 13th of July, the fleet finally bade adieu to the land. Was Friday an unlucky day? Some of the sailors thought so, and would have been glad to leave a day before or after. But Columbus sailed on Friday, and discovered the New World on Friday. And so this expedition put to sea on Friday, and, as a good Providence would have it, reached land on the other side of the Atlantic on the same day of the week. As the ships disappeared below the horizon, Mr. Glass and Mr. Varley went up on their watch tower, not to look, but to listen for the first voice from the sea. The ships bore away from the buoy where lay the end of the shore line, but the weather was thick and foggy, with frequent bursts of rain, and they could not see far on the water. For an hour or two they went sailing round and round, like seagulls in search of prey. At length the Albany caught sight of the buoy tossing on the waves, and firing a signal gun, bore down straight upon it. The cable was soon hauled up from its bed, 100 fathoms deep, and brought over the stern of the Great Eastern, and the watchers on shore, who had been waiting with some impatience, saw the first flash, and Varley read, "Got the shore end, all right, going to make the splice." Then all was still, and they knew that that delicate operation was going on. Quick, nimble hands tore off the covering from some yards of the shore end of the main cable, till they came to the core. Then, swiftly unwinding the copper wires, they laid them together, twining them as closely and carefully as a silken braid. Thus stripped and bare, this new-born child of the sea was wrapped in swaddling clothes, covered up with many coatings of gutta percha and hempen rope, and strong iron wires, the whole bound round and round with heavy bands, and the splicing was complete. Signals were now sent through the whole cable on board the Great Eastern, and back to the telegraph house of Valentia, and the whole length, 2,440 nautical miles, was reported perfect. And so with light hearts they bore away. It was a little after 3 o'clock. As they turned to the west, the following was the order of battle. The Terrible went ahead, standing off on the starboard bow to keep other vessels out of the course. The Medway was on the port, and the Albany on the starboard quarter, ready to pick up or let go a buoy, or to do other work that might be required. All these ships were to keep their allotted positions, with signalling distance of the Great Eastern, and at any time that she was heard firing guns they were to close in with her to render assistance. Their course lay 30 miles to the south of that of the last year, so that there could be no danger in fishing for the old cable of disturbing the new. Dr. Russell, the brilliant historian of the expedition of 1865, was not on board the Great Eastern this year. He had left England a few weeks before for the scene of the war in Germany. His place was supplied by Mr. John C. Deane, the Secretary of the Anglo-American Company, whose diary of the expedition furnishes a faithful record of the incidents of this memorable voyage. If the story be not quite so thrilling as that of the year before, it is because it has not to tell of such fatal accidents. It has the monotony of success. A few pages from this diary, giving its most important portions, will render this narrative complete. The voyage began with good weather and every omen of success. Friday indeed was a day of fog and rain. At the very time they were making the splice with the shore end, the rain was pouring on the deck. But in a few hours it cleared off, and Saturday and Sunday Mr. Field writes in his journal, "Weather fine." On Monday, "Calm, beautiful day. Signals perfect." Owing to the improved system adopted by the chief electrician, communication with the shore was kept up even while the tests for insulation were going on. Footnote A. The new method is thus explained by Mr. Deane. The fundamental difference between last year's system of testing and that of the present expedition is, that now all the ordinary tests for continuity may be made simultaneously with the test for insulation, which is not interrupted at all, whereas last year, during half the time spent in laying the cable, the insulation test was wholly neglected. Last year each hour was divided into 4 parts. The first half of the hour was spent in testing for insulation. During the second half, which was divided into 3 periods of 10 minutes each, tests were made to ascertain the resistance of the conductor and to prove the continuity of the same. All these tests were of such a nature as to afford no criterion whatever of the state of the insulation during their continuance, so that during the half of each hour, or, in other words, during half the time spent in laying the cable, The insulation test was neglected. Also, while the insulation test was being made, there were no means of communicating with the shore, as the observations were taken on board only. This year a test for insulation is constantly kept on, and by Mr. Willoughby Smith's arrangement, corresponding observations are made both on ship and shore. At stated times during the hour, the continuity test is made at the shore station by means of a condenser applied to the conductor of the cable. The effect of this is to increase the deflection on the ship's insulation galvanometer, thus serving as a continuity test. Communications from shore to ship are also made by these means. The ship can send signals to the shore by simply reversing the current for certain lengths of time, answering to some understood code, or by increasing and diminishing the tension of the line according to a prearranged plan. All these operations may be performed without interrupting the insulation test, except for a few seconds while the current is being reversed. So far for the new system in the electrical room as compared with last year. End footnote. Every possible precaution was taken to guard against such accidents as had marred the success of the year before. Remembering how small a thing had sufficed to puncture the cable, the men in the tank were not allowed to wear boots or shoes with nails in their heels, but were cased from head to foot in canvas dresses, drawn over their ordinary sailor costume, and with slippers on their feet, they glided about softly as ghosts. But we turn to Mr. Deane's diary for a record of the progress from day to day. Sunday, July 15th. All through yesterday the paying out machinery worked so smoothly, the electrical tests were so perfect, the weather was so fine that fresh confidence in the ultimate result had been naturally inspired. The recollection, however, of the reverses of the expedition of 1865 is always before those who have the greatest reliance of success, and there is a quiet repose about the manner of the chief practical men on board, which is an earnest that they will not allow themselves to be carried away by the smoothness of 24 hours' events. The convoy kept their position accurately during the day. The Terrible signalled that a man had fallen overboard. Her cutter was speedily lowered. The sailor had, however, laid hold of a rope thrown to him from the frigate before the boat reached him. Monday. Still everything going on well, the sea like a mill pond, the paying out of the cable from the after tank progressing with uniformity and steadiness, and electrical tests perfect. Our track is about 30 miles to the south of that of last year, and at that distance we pass parallel to where the telegraph cable parted in August 1857. Our average speed has been about 5 knots. We are obliged to stop the screw engines in order to bring down to that speed, and moreover to reduce the paddle boiler power. Captain Anderson's ingenious mode of cleaning the ship's bottom, which he carried out last winter at Sheerness, has proved to have effected this very desirable object. Mr. Beckwith, the engineer, is now enabled to regulate and adjust her speed, and get more out of the ship than he could last year, when her bottom was one encrusted mass of mussels. Tuesday. Another 24 hours of uninterrupted success. All day yesterday was so calm that the masts of our convoy were reflected in the ocean, an unusual thing to see. A large shoal of porpoises gambolled about us for half an hour. A glorious sunset, and later a crescent moon, which we hope to see in the brightness of her full, lighting our way into Trinity Bay before the days of this July shall have ended. But the whole night did not pass away so tranquilly. By midnight the rain fell fast, and the wind blew fiercely, and then occurred the only real alarm of the voyage. The scene is thus described by Mr. Deane. All went on well until 20 minutes past 12 a.m., Greenwich time, when the first real shock was given to the success which has hitherto attended us. In this time we had real cause to be alarmed. A foul flake took place in the after tank. The engines were immediately turned astern, and the paying out of the cable stopped. We were all soon on deck, and learned that the running or paying out part of the coil had caught 3 turns of the flake immediately under it, carried them into the eye of the coil, fouling the layout, and hauling up 1½ turns from the outside, and 5 turns in the eye of the under flake. This was stopped, fortunately, before entering the paying out machinery. Stoppers of hemp also were put on near the V wheel astern, and Mr. Canning gave orders to stand by to let go the buoy. This was not very cheering to hear, but his calm and collected manner gave us all confidence that his skill and experience would extricate the cable from the obvious danger in which it was placed. No fishing line was ever entangled worse than the rope was when thrust up in apparently hopeless knots from the eye of the coil to the deck. There at last 500 feet of rope lay in this state, in the midst of thick rain and increasing wind. The cable crews set to work, under their chief engineer's instructions, to disentangle it. Mr. Halpin was there too, patiently following the bights as they showed themselves, the crew now passing them forward, now aft, until at last the character of the tangle was seen, and soon it became apparent that ere long the cable would be cleared. All this time Captain Anderson was at the taffrail, anxiously watching the strain on the rope, which he could scarcely make out, the night was so dark, and endeavoring to keep it up and down, going on and reversing with paddle and screw. When one reflects for a moment upon the size of the ship and the enormous mass she presents to the wind, the difficulty of keeping her astern, under the circumstances, over the cable, can be appreciated. The port paddle wheel was disconnected, but shortly afterward there was a shift of wind, and the vessel canted the wrong way. Welcome voices were now heard passing the word off from the tank that the bights were cleared and to pay out. Then the huge stoppers were gently loosened, and at 5 minutes past 2 A.M., to the joy of all, we were once more discharging the cable. They veered it away in the tank to clear away the foul flake until 3 A.M., when the screw and paddle engines were slowed so as to reduce the speed of the ship to 4½ knots. During all this critical time there was an entire absence of noise and confusion. Every order was silently obeyed, and the cable men and crew worked with hearty good will. Mr. Canning has had experience of foul flakes before, and showed that he knew what to do in the emergency. But what of the electrical condition of the cable during this period? Simply that through its entire length it was perfect. Thus, after 3 anxious hours, the danger was past, and the next morning the report of the ship is "a fresh breeze from the southward, a dull gray sky, with occasional rain and a moderate sea." Thursday. There was a fresh breeze in the afternoon yesterday, increasing toward evening. It brought a heavy swell on the port quarter, which caused the ship to roll. The paying out from the after tank went on steadily. 2 of the large buoys were lifted by derrick from the deck into the bows of the ship, and placed in position on the port and starboard side of the forward pick-up machinery, ready for letting go if necessary. The sun went down with an angry look, and the scud came rapidly from the eastward, the sea rising. A wind dead aft is not the best for cable laying, particularly if any accident should take place. By 11:30 to-night we shall have exhausted the contents of the after tank, and the cable will then be paid out from the fore tank along the trough to the stern, the distance from the center of the tank to the paying out machinery being 494 feet. Last night the swell was very heavy, to which the Great Eastern proved herself not insensible. Her rolling, like everything else appertaining to her, is done on a grand scale. We see the liveliness with which that operation is performed on board the Albany and Medway, and we are not at all disposed to be too critical in our observations on our own movements. The speed of the ship was kept at 4½ during the night. The slower the better, is the opinion of all on board. Festina lente. We are consuming about 100 tons a day of the 7,000 tons of coal which we had on board when we left Berehaven, and Mr. Beckworth, who has been engineer of the Great Eastern from her first voyage to the present moment, says her engines were never in better order, and their appearance and working do him and his able staff of assistant engineers the greatest credit. Friday. Yesterday was a day of complete success, the paying out in every respect satisfactory. The wind still from the eastward, but inclined to draw to the northward, the sea entirely gone down. As Mr. Canning told us, we should see the after tank emptied at 11 o'clock, ship's time. We were all collected there about 10 o'clock, by which time the cable was down to the last flake. Next to having daylight for changing from the after to the fore tank, we could not have had a more favorable time. Clear starlight, no wind, and a smooth sea. Looking down into the tank, the scene was highly picturesque. The cable watch, whose figures were lighted up by the lamps suspended from above, slowly and cautiously lifted the turns of the coil to ease their path to the eye. As each found its way to the drum, the wooden floor of the tank showed itself, and then we saw more floor, and as its area increased the cable swept along its surface with a low subdued noise, until, with a graceful curve, it mounted to the outlet, where it was soon to join a fresh supply. And now we hear the word passed that they have arrived at the last turn, and the men who stood on the stages of the platform of the eye with the bight watch the arrival of the cable and pass it up with tender caution until it reaches the summit. Then it rushes down a wooden incline to meet the spliced rope, which had by this time come down along the trough leading from the forward tank. This operation was conducted with great skill by Mr. Canning and his experienced assistants, Messrs. Clifford and Temple. At 11 minutes past 1 A.M., Greenwich time, the fresh rope was going over the stern, and the screw engines going ahead at 13 minutes past 1. A watch of 4 men is now stationed, fore and aft, all along the trough, which is illuminated by many lamps at short distances from each other. A lamp with a green light indicates the mile mark as it comes up from the tank, and this signal is repeated until it reaches the stern, where it is recorded by the clerk who keeps the cable log, in an office adjoining the paying out machinery. A red lamp indicates danger. During the daytime red and blue flags are used. All through the night the sea was smooth as glass, and by this morning we saw that a sensible impression had been made on the contents of the fore tank. The ship begins to lighten at the bows, and by this time to-morrow will come up more as the cable passes out of the tank. Saturday. Yesterday was our 7th day of paying out cable, and so far we have been more fortunate than the expedition of last year. During the same period of 1865 two faults had occurred, one on the 24th of July, the other on the 29th, causing a detention of 56 hours. At 3 P.M. we were half-way, and passed with the Atlantic cable of 1858 parted twice on the 26th and 28th of June. Sad memories to many. We feel, however, that every hour is increasing our chance of effecting this great work. "I believe we shall do it this time, Jack," I heard one of our crew say to another last night. "I believe so too, Bill," was the reply, "and if we don't, we deserve to do it, and that's all." It blew very hard from 2 o'clock yesterday up to 10 P.M., by which time the wind gradually found its way from southwest to northwest, which is right ahead, just what we want for cable laying. The Terrible and the two other ships plunged into the very heavy sea which the southwester raised, and we made up our minds, from what we saw, that the Great Eastern is the right ship to be in a gale of wind. During the night heavy showers of rain. This morning the sea was comparatively smooth, and the sky showed welcome patches of bright blue. If all goes well, we shall be up to-morrow evening at the place where last year's cable parted. A couple of days will bring us to shallower water, and then we may fairly look out for our heart's content. Messages come from England with the news regularly and speedily. Excellent practice for the clerks on shore and on board ship. Great comfort to us, and the best evidence to those who will read this journal, of the great fact that up to this time the cable is doing its electric work efficiently. The interest of the voyage was greatly increased by the news daily received from Europe. Though in the middle of the Atlantic, they were still joined with the Old World, and messages came to the Great Eastern Telegraph as regularly as to the Times in London, reporting the quotations of the Stock Exchange, the debates in Parliament, and all the news of home. But what was far more exciting was the tidings of the great events transpiring on the Continent. While the expedition had been preparing in England, a war had broken out of tremendous magnitude. Austria, Prussia, and Italy had rushed into the field. Armies, such as had not met since the fatal day of Leipsic, stood in battle array, and the thunder of war was echoing and re-echoing among the mountains of Bohemia. Amid these convulsions the fleet set sail, but it was still linked with the nations which it left behind, and received tidings from day to day. What great events were thus heralded to them in mid-ocean may be seen by a few items gleaned from the numerous dispatches. End of Part 1 of Chapter 16. Recorded by Alex C. Talander. www.bookbanter.net. Part 2 of Chapter 16 of The Story of the Atlantic Telegraph. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Atlantic Telegraph by Henry M. Field. Chapter 16. Victory at Last. Part 2. Saturday evening, July 14th. General Cialdini is moving upon Rovigo with an army of 100,000 men and 200 guns. The Austrians have evacuated the whole country between the Mincio and Adige. A day or two later, Cialdini has occupied Padua, 23 miles from Venice, on the railway connecting that city with the Quadrilateral, and the Austrians are shut up in Venice. Tuesday, 17th. Prussians had successful engagement before Olmütz yesterday. Captured 6 guns. Further fighting expected today. Austrians withdrawing from Moldavia toward Vienna. Conflict between Prussians and Federals. Prussians completely victorious. Federals evacuating Frankfurt and Prussians marching there. Thursday, 19th. Prussians repeating victories and gaining adhesions from small states. The main army within 50 miles of Vienna. Have cut the railway to Vienna. Austrian army between Prussians and Vienna, under Archduke, 160,000 men. Money and archives removed from Vienna to Comorn. 20th. Frankfurt occupied by the Prussians, who are marching on Vienna. Yesterday, Italian fleet, consisting of ironclad vessels and several steamers, opened attack on island of Lissa, on the coast of Dalmatia. Results not known. The next day it is reported thus: several naval engagement off Lissa. Austrians claimed the victory. Sunk 1 Italian ironclad, run down another, blew up a third. July 21st. Prussians crossed river. Marched near Holitzon, Hungary. Austria accepted proposal of armistice. Prussia will be abstained from hostilities for 5 days, during which Austria will have to notify acceptance of preliminaries. a long letter published from the King of Prussia to the Queen, giving account of battle of Königgrätz. The interest excited by such news may be imagined, coming while the events were yet fresh. Twice a day the bulletin set up on the deck, and was surrounded by an eager crowd, reading what had transpired on the Continent but a few hours before. Nor was the intelligence confined to the Great Eastern. By an arrangement of signals, more complete than ever was used in a squadron before, the news was telegraphed to the convoy. All the ships had been furnished with experienced signalmen by the Admiralty. The system adopted was that known as Colom's flash signals, by which, even in the darkest night, messages could easily be flashed to a distance of several miles. Thus all the ships were supplied with news twice a day, and the great military events in Europe were discussed in every cabin as eagerly as in the clubs of London. Again Deane's diary reports: "Sunday, July 22nd. Still success to record. A bright, clear day with a fresh and invigorating breeze from the northwest. Cable going out with an unerring smoothness, at the rate of 6 miles an hour. There has been great improvement in the insulation. This remarkable improvement is attributable to the greatly decreased temperature of, and pressure on, the cable in the sea. This is a very satisfactory result to Mr. Willoughby Smith. Signals, too, come every hour more distinctly. This morning the breeze freshened. We are now about 30 miles to the southward of the place where the cable parted on the 2nd of August, 1865, having then paid out 1,213 miles. Captain Anderson read divine service in the dining saloon. Monday. Between 6 and 7 P.M. yesterday, we passed over the deepest part of our course. There was no additional strain on the dynamometer, which indicated from 10 to 1400, the cable going out with its accustomed regularity. The wind still fresh from the northwest. During the night it went round to the southwest, and this morning there is a long roll from the southward. At 46 minutes past 11 A.M., Mr. Cyrus Field sent a message to Valentia, requesting Mr. Glass to obtain the latest news from Egypt, India, and China, and other distant countries, so that on our arrival at Heart's Content we shall be able to transmit it to the principal cities of the United States. In just 8 minutes he had a reply in these words: "Your message received, and is in London by this." Outside the telegraph room there is a placard put up, on which it posted the news shortly after its arrival, and groups of the crew may be seen reading it, just as we see a crowd at a newspaper office in London. Mr. Dudley, the artist, has made a very spirited sketch of Jack reading the morning news, for he is supplied with the latest intelligence from the seat of war twice a day. Footnote B. Mr. Dudley made a number of sketches for Mr. Field, with several large paintings, which have furnished the illustrations for this volume. End footnote. How he will grumble when he gets ashore! He is not going to pay £1 for word for news, but his newspaper will supply it to him, and he does not know or care what it costs. But what a sum has been spent in Atlantic telegraphs! It cannot now fall short of £2,500,000 of pounds, or over $12 millions of dollars. More millions will be found if it shall be practically proved that America can permanently talk to England, and through her to the Eastern Hemisphere, and England to America by this ocean wire. At 11:45 to-day, but 250 miles of cable remain to be paid out of the fore tank. To-morrow night we hope to see it empty, then for a small supply from the main tank, and then, but, hopeful though we are, let us not anticipate. Tuesday. Breakfast at 8, lunch at 1, dinner at 6, tea at 8, 502 souls who live on board this huge ship following their prescribed occupations. Cable going out merrily. Electrical tests and signals perfect, and this is the history of what has taken place from noon yesterday to noon today. May we have 3 days more of such delightful monotony. It rained very hard during yesterday evening, and as we approach the banks of Newfoundland we get thick and hazy weather. The latter part of the voyage did not fulfill, in all respects, the promise of the first. The bright skies were gone, and instead perpetual fog hung over the water, while often the clouds poured down their floods. Thus the diary continues: Wednesday. Fog and thick rain, just the weather to expect on approaching the banks of Newfoundland. The convoy keep their position, and though sometimes the fog hides the ships from our view, yet we know where they are by their signal whistles, 2 from the Terrible, 3 from the Medway, and 4 from the Albany, which are replied to by the prolonged single shriek from our whistle. At 42 minutes past 1, Greenwich time, ship's time 45 minutes past 10 P.M. last night, the fore tank being nearly empty, preparations were made for passing the bight of the cable into the main tank. At 50 minutes past 2, all the jockey wheels of the paying out machinery were up, and the brakes released. 23 minutes past 2, the bight was passed steadily and cautiously by the cable hands outside of the trough to the main tank, and at 35 minutes past 2 the splice went over the stern in 1,542.8 fathoms. By arrangement with Sir James Hope, the Admiral of the North American Station, who has received instructions from the Admiralty to give the present expedition every assistance in his power, a frigate or sloop will be placed in longitude 48 degrees 28 minutes 52 seconds, which is just 30 miles from the entrance of Trinity Bay, and 60 from Heart's Content. She will probably hang on by a kedge in that position, which shows the fair way right up the bay, and if it be clear, we ought to see her about daybreak on Friday morning. The fog was very thick this morning, but occasionally lifts. As long as the wind is from southwest, we cannot expect clear weather. As the week drew on, it was evident that they were approaching the end of their voyage. By Thursday they had passed the great depths of the Atlantic, and were off soundings. Besides their daily observations, there were many signs, well known to mariners, that they were near the coast. There were the sea birds, and they could almost snuff the smell of the land, such as once greeted the sharp senses of Columbus, and made him sure that he was floating to some undiscovered shore. Captain Anderson had timed his departure so that he should approach the American coast at the full moon, but for the last 2 or 3 nights, as the round orb rose behind them, banks of cloud hung so heavily upon the water that the moonlight only gleamed faintly through the vaporous air, and the fleet seemed like the phantom ships of the ancient mariner, drifting on through fog and mist. Thursday. All day yesterday was as thick as mustard. We have had now 48 hours of fog. Though it lifted a little this morning at 5 A.M., it still looks like more of it. Captain Anderson signalled to the Albany at 15 minutes past 10 last night to start at daybreak and proceed to discover the station ship, and report us at hand. Should she fail to find her, then to try and make the land and guide us up to Trinity Bay. Another signal was sent at 12:30 to the effect that the Terrible and Medway will be sent ahead to meet the Albany and establish a line to lead us in even with a fog. The Albany started at 3:30. At 45 minutes past 4 Greenwich time, the cable engineer in charge took one weight off each brake of the paying out machinery. At 40 minutes past 7, all weights taken off, the assumed depth being 300 fathoms. The indicated strain on the dynamometer gradually decreasing. Speed of ship 5 knots. We are going to try and pick up the cable of 1865 in 2,500 fathoms, and we mean to succeed too. Therefore, should the cable we are now paying out part, it can be understood how easy it will be to raise it from a depth of 300 fathoms. At 55 minutes past 8 we signalled to the Terrible to sound, and received a reply, 160 fathoms. At 11:30 we informed her that when at the buoy off Heart's Content she should have a paddle-box boat and 2 cutters ready to be alongside immediately, for holding the bight of the cable during the splice and laying the shore end. The Medway was told at the same time to prepare 2 5-inch ropes and 2 large mushroom anchors, with 50 fathoms of chain, for anchoring during the splice in 170 fathoms of water, and we intimated to her that when in sight of Trinity Bay we should signal for 2 boats to take hands on board her for shore end. News of to-day, telegram from Mr. Glass in reply to one from Mr. Canning. I congratulate you all most sincerely on your arrival in 130 fathoms. I hope nothing will interfere to mar the hitherto brilliant success, and that the cable will be landed to-morrow. As the voyage is about to end, we give the distance run from day to day, which show a remarkable uniformity for progress. Saturday, 14th, distance run 108, cable paid out 115. Sunday, 15th, distance run 128, cable paid out 139. Monday, 16th, distance run 115, cable paid out 137. Tuesday, 17th, distance run 117, cable paid out 138. Wednesday, 18th, distance run 104, cable paid out 125. Thursday, 19th, distance run 112, cable paid out 129. Friday, 20th, distance run 117, cable paid out 127. Saturday, 21st, distance run 121, cable paid out 136. Sunday, 22nd, distance run 123, cable paid out 133. Monday, 23rd, distance run 121, cable paid out 138. Tuesday, 24th, distance run 120, cable paid out 135. Wednesday, 25th, distance run 119, cable paid out 130. Thursday, 26th, distance run 128, cable paid out 134. Friday, 27th, distance run 100, Cable paid out 104. From this it appears that the speed of the ship was exactly according to the running time fixed before she left England. On the last voyage it was thought that she had once or twice run too fast, and thus exposed the cable to danger. It was therefore decided to go slowly but surely. Holding her back to this moderate pace, her average speed from the time the splice was made till they saw land was a little less than 5 nautical miles an hour, while the cable was paid out at an average of not quite 5½ miles. Thus the total slack was about 11%, showing that the cable was laid almost in a straight line, allowing for the swells and hollows in the bottom of the sea. Friday, July 27th. Shortly after 2 P.M. yesterday, two ships, which were soon made out to be steamers, were seen to the westward, and the Terrible, steaming on ahead, in about an hour, signalled to us that H.M.S. Niger was one of them, accompanied by the Albany. The Niger, Captain Bruce, sent a boat to the Terrible as soon as he came up with her. The Albany shortly afterward took up her position on her starboard quarter, and signalled that she spoke the Niger at noon, bearing east by north, and that the Lily was anchored at the station at the entrance of Trinity Bay, as arranged with the Admiral. The Albany also reported that she had passed an iceberg about 60 feet high. At 20 minutes after 4 P.M. the Niger came on our port side, quite close, and Captain Bruce, sending the crew to the rigging and manning the yards, gave us 3 cheers, which were heartily returned by the Great Eastern. She then steamed ahead toward Trinity Bay. The Albany was signalled to go on immediately to Heart's Content, clear the northeast side of the harbor of shipping, and place a boat with a red flag for Captain Anderson to steer to, for anchorage. Just before dinner we saw on the southern horizon, distant about 10 miles, an iceberg, probably the one which the Albany met with. It was apparently about 50 or 60 feet in height. The fog came on very thick about 8 P.M., and between that and 10 we were constantly exchanging guns and burning blue lights with the Terrible, which, with the Niger, went in search of the Lily, station ship. The Terrible being signalled to come up and take her position, informed us they had made the Lily out, and that she bore them about east-northeast, distant 4 miles. Later in the night, Captain Coverall said that if Captain Anderson would stop the Great Eastern, he would send the surveyor, Mr. Robinson, R.N., who came out in the Niger, on board of us, and about 3 the engines were slowed, and the Terrible shortly afterwards came alongside with that officer. Catalina Light, at the entrance of Trinity Bay, had been made out 3 hours before this, and the loom of the coast had also been seen. Fog still prevailing. According to Mr. Robinson's account, if they got one clear day in 7 at the entrance of Trinity Bay, they considered themselves fortunate. Here we are now, 6 A.M., within 10 miles of Heart's Content, and we can scarcely see more than a ship's length. The Niger, however, is ahead, and her repeated guns tell us where we are with accuracy. Good fortune follows us, and scarcely has 8 o'clock arrived when the massive curtain of fog raises itself gradually from both shores of Trinity Bay, disclosing to us the entrance of Heart's Content. The Albany making for the harbor, the Margarita Stevenson, surveying the vessel, steaming out to meet us, the prearranged pathway all marked with buoys by Mr. J. H. Kerr, R.N., and a whole fleet of fishing boats fishing at the entrance. We could now plainly see that Heart's Content, so far as its capabilities permitted, was prepared to welcome us. The British and American flags floated from the church and telegraph station and other buildings. We had dressed ship, fired a salute, and given 3 cheers, and Captain Comerell of H.M.S. Terrible was soon on board to congratulate us on our success. At 9 o'clock ship's time, just as we had cut the cable and made arrangements for the Medway to lay the shore end, a message arrived giving us the concluding words of a leader in this morning's Times. "It is a great work, a glory to our age and nation, and the men who have achieved it deserve to be honored among the benefactors of their race. Treaty of peace signed between Prussia and Austria." It was now time for the chief engineer, Mr. Canning, to make the necessary preparations for splicing on board the Medway. Accompanied by Mr. Gooch, M.P., Mr. Clifford, Mr. Willoughby Smith, and Messrs. Temple and Dean, he went on board the Terrible, and Niger having sent their paddle-box boats and cutters to assist. Shortly afterward the Great Eastern steamed into the harbor and anchored on the northeast side, and was quickly surrounded by boats laden with visitors. Mr. Cyrus Field had come on shore before the Great Eastern had left the offing, with a view of telegraphing to St. John's to hire a vessel to repair the cable unhappily broke between Cape Ray in Newfoundland and Cape North in Breton Island. Before a couple of hours the shore end will be landed, and it is impossible to conceive a finer day for effecting this our final operation. Even here people can scarcely realize the fact that the Atlantic telegraph cable has been laid. Tomorrow, however, Heart's Content. Footnote C. The little harbor that bears this general name is a sheltered nook where ships may ride at anchor, safe from the storms of the ocean. It is but an inlet from the great arm of the sea known as Trinity Bay, which is 60 or 70 miles long and 20 miles broad. On the beach is a small village of some 60 houses, most of which are the humble dwellings of those hardy men who vex the northern seas with their fisheries. The place was never heard of outside of Newfoundland till 1864, when Mr. Field, sailing up Trinity Bay in the surveying steamer Margaretta Stephenson, Captain Orlebar, R.N., in search of a place for the landing of the ocean cable, fixed upon this secluded spot. The old landing of 1858 was at the Bay of Bull's Arms, at the head of Trinity Bay, 20 miles above. Heart's Content was chosen now because its waters are still and deep, so that a cable skirting the north side of the banks of Newfoundland can be brought in deep water almost till it touches the shore. All around the land rises to pine-crested heights, and here the telegraphic fleet, after its memorable voyage, lay in quiet, under the shadow of the encircling hills. Will awaken to the fact that it is a highly favored place in the world's esteem, the western landing place of that marvel of electric communication with the eastern hemisphere, which is now happily, and we hope finally, established. This simple record, so modestly termed the Diary of the Expedition, tells the story of this memorable voyage in a way that needs no embellishment. But if from the ship's deck we transfer ourselves to the shore, we may get a new impression of the closing scene. We can well believe the sensation of wonder and almost of awe on the morning when the ships entered that little harbor of Newfoundland. In England the progress of the expedition was known from day to day, but on this side of the ocean all was uncertainty. Some had gone to Heart's Content, hoping to witness the arrival of the fleet, but not so many as the year before, for the memory of the last failure was too fresh, and they feared another disappointment. But still a faithful few were there, who kept their daily watch. The correspondents of the American papers report only a long and anxious suspense, till the morning when the first ship was seen in the offing. As they looked toward her, she came nearer, and see, there is another, and another! And now the hull of the Great Eastern loomed up all glorious in the morning sky. They were coming! Instantly all was wild excitement on shore. Boats put off to row toward the fleet. The Albany was the first to round the point and enter the bay. The Terrible was close behind. The Medway stopped an hour or two to join on the heavy shore end, while the Great Eastern, gliding calmly in as if she had done nothing remarkable, dropped her anchor in front of the Telegraph House, having trailed behind her a chain of 2,000 miles, to bind the Old World to the New. That same afternoon, as soon as the shore end was landed, Captain Anderson and the officers of the fleet went in a body to the little church in Heart's Content, to render thanks for the success of the expedition. A sermon was preached on the next, "There shall be no more sea," and all joined in the sublime prayers and thanksgivings of the Church of England. Thus the voyage ended as it began. It left the shores of Ireland with prayers, wafted after it as a benediction, and now, safely landed on the shores of the New World, this gallant company, like Columbus and his companions, made it their first thought to render homage to the Being who had borne them safely across the deep. But though their voyage was ended, there was still a work to be done. Having crossed the Atlantic, the first thing was to open communication with the cities of the United States, and now Mr. Field was extremely mortified to find that there was a large gap in the line this side of the ocean. His first question to the superintendent, who came out in a boat to meet him, was in regard to the cable across the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which had been interrupted the year before, and it was a bitter pang to hear that it lay still broken, so that a message which came from Ireland in a moment of time was delayed 24 hours in its way to New York. Of course the public grew impatient, and there were many sneers at the want of foresight which had failed to provide against such a contingency, and, as he was the one chiefly known in connection with the enterprise, these reproaches fell upon him. He did not tell the public what was the truth, that he had anticipated this very trouble long ago, and entreated his associates to be prepared for it. Months before he left for England, he urged upon the Company in New York the necessity of rebuilding their lines in Newfoundland, which had been standing over 10 years, and of repairing the old cable, and also laying a new one across the Gulf of St. Lawrence. But this would cost a large sum of money, and as their faith and purses had been sorely tried by repeated disasters, they were not willing to spend more in the uncertainty of the future. They wished to see the result of this new expedition before advancing further capital. We do not blame them, but only mention the fact to show that Mr. Field had foreseen this very thing, and endeavored to guard against it. But regrets were idle. What could he do to repair the injury? Is there a steamer, he asked, to be had in these waters? The Bloodhound is at St. John's. Telegraph instantly to charter her to go around to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and fish up the old cable and repair it. But that may take several weeks. Is there nothing else that can serve in the meantime to carry dispatches across the Gulf? There is a little steamer, called the Dauntless. We'll telegraph for her too, secure at all hazards, Only see that the work is done." All this was the work of a few minutes. The answers came back quickly, and in a day or two came the steamers themselves. The arrangement was immediately carried out. The Dauntless took her place in the Gulf, where she made her regular trips from Port aux Basques, in Newfoundland, to Aspy Bay in Cape Breton, keeping up daily communication with the States. The Bloodhound, which had a more difficult task, first took on board 11 miles of cable from the Great Eastern, to repair that which was broken. The expedition was put in charge of Mr. A. M. Mackay, the indefatigable superintendent of the company in Newfoundland, who had had the care of their lines for 10 years. He sailed for Aspy Bay, and made short work of the business, dragging the gulf and raising the cable, which he found had been broken by an anchor, in water 70 fathoms deep, a few miles from shore. This was spliced out with a portion of the new cable, and the whole was as perfect as ever, giving a fresh proof that cables well made are likely to be permanent, if not indestructible. Meanwhile, owing to this interruption of the cable across the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the news of the success of the expedition, which reached Newfoundland on Friday, the 27th, did not reach New York till the 29th. It was early Sunday morning, before the Sabbath bells had rung their call to prayer, that the tidings came. The first announcement was brief: "Heart's Content, July 27th. We arrived here at 9 o'clock this morning. All well. Thank God the cable is laid, and is in perfect working order. Cyrus W. Field." Soon followed the dispatch to the Associated Press, giving the details of the voyage, and ending with a just tribute to the skill and devotion of all who had contributed to its success. Said Mr. Field: "I cannot find words suitable to convey my admiration for the men who have so ably conducted the nautical, engineering, and electrical departments of this enterprise, amidst difficulties which must be seen to be appreciated. In fact, all on board of the Telegraph fleet, and all connected with the enterprise, have done their best to have the cable made and laid in a perfect condition, and He who rules the winds and the waves has crowned their united efforts with perfect success." Other dispatches followed in quick succession, giving the latest events of the war in Europe, which startled the public just reading news a fortnight old. All this confirmed the great triumph, and filled every heart with wonder and gratitude on the Sunday morning, as they went again to the little church, and rendered thanks to Him who is Lord of the earth and sea. While the Great Eastern was lying in the harbor of Heart's Content, she was overrun with visitors. The news of her arrival had spread over the island, and from far and near the people flocked to see her. Over the hills they came on foot and on horseback, and in wagons and carts of every description, and from along the shore in boats and fishing smacks, in sloops and schooners. They came from the most remote parts of the island, a distance of 300 miles, and even from the province of New Brunswick. Several parties made the excursion in steamers from St. John's. The wondering country folk climbed up the sides of the ship, and wandered for hours through its spacious rooms and long passages. All were welcomed with hearty sailor courtesy. As soon as communication was opened with New York and other cities, congratulations poured in from every quarter. Friendly messages were exchanged, as 8 years before, between the Sovereign of England and the head of the great republic. The President also, and Mr. Seward, Secretary of State, sent their congratulations to Mr. Field, greetings that were repeated from the most distant states. Among others was a message from San Francisco, which was put into its hand almost at the same moment with one from M. de Lesseps, dated at Alexandria in Egypt. What a meeting and mingling of voices was this, when a winged salutation, flying over the tops of the Rocky Mountains, reached the same ear with a message which had been whispered along the Mediterranean and under the Atlantic; when the farthest east touched the farthest west, the most ancient of kingdoms answering to the new-born empire of the Pacific. End of chapter 16. Recorded by Alex C. Talander. www.bookbanter.net. Chapter 17 of The Story of the Atlantic Telegraph. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Atlantic Telegraph by Henry M. Field. Chapter 17. Recovery of the Lost Cable. Part 1. Though the Great Eastern was still lying in the little harbor of Heart's Content, casting her mighty shadow on its tranquil waters, she was not content with her amazing victory, but sighed for another greater still. Though she had done enough to be laid up for a year, she still had one more test of her prowess: to recover the cable of 1865, which had been lost in the middle of the Atlantic. So eager were all for this second trial of their strength, that in less than 5 days 2 of the ships, the Albany and the Terrible, the vanguard of the telegraphic fleet, were on their way back to mid-ocean. Though it was only Friday, the 27th of July, that they had reached land, they left early Wednesday morning, the first day of August. The Great Eastern was detained a week longer. She had to lay in immense supplies of coal. Anticipating this want, 6 ships had been dispatched from Cardiff, in Wales, weeks before, to await the arrival of the fleet. One of these foundered at sea. The others arrived out safely, and hardly had the Great Eastern cast anchor before they were alongside, ready to fill her bunkers. So ample was the provision that, when she went to sea a few days after, she had nearly 8,000 tons of coal on board. At the same time she had to receive some 600 miles of the cable of 1865, which had been shipped from England in the Medway. The latter was now brought alongside, and the whole was transferred into the main tank of the Great Eastern, from which it was to be paid out in case the lost end were recovered. At length all these preparations were completed, and on Thursday, the 9th of August, the Great Eastern and the Medway put to sea. The Governor of Newfoundland, who had come around from St. John's and been received with the honors due his rank, accompanied them in the Lily down the broad expanse of Trinity Bay, and then bore away for St. John's, while the Great Eastern and Medway kept on their course, to join their companions in the middle of the Atlantic. They had a little over 600 miles to run to the fishing ground, and made it in 3 days. On Sunday noon they came in sight of the appointed rendezvous, and soon with glasses made out the Albany and the Terrible, which had arrived a week before, and placed buoys to mark the line of the cable, and then, like giant sea birds with folded wings, sat watching their prey. The sea was running high, so the boats could not come off, but the Albany signalled that she had not toiled for nothing, that she had once hooked the cable, but lost it in rough weather. The history of this first attempt, though brief, was cheering. When the Albany left Heart's Content, Captain Moriarty went in her. He had been in the Great Eastern the year before, and saw where the cable went down, and had had his eye on the spot ever since. He claimed, with Captain Anderson, that he could go straight to it and place the ship within half a mile of where it disappeared. At this old sailors shook their heads and said, "They'd like to see him do it. No man could come within 2 or 3 miles of any given place in the ocean." Yet the result proved the exactness of his observations. With unerring eye he went straight to the spot, and set his buoys as exactly as a fisherman sets his nets. In the Albany also had gone Mr. Temple, of Mr. Canning's staff. The ship had been fitted with a complete set of buoys and apparatus for grappling, and he was full of ambition to recover the cable before the Great Eastern should come up. In this he had nearly proved successful. They had caught it once, and raised it a few hundred fathoms from the bottom, and buoyed it, but rough weather came on and tore away the buoy, so that the cable went down again, carrying 2 miles of rope. This was a disappointment, but still, as their first attempt was only a feeler, the result was encouraging. It showed that they had found the right place, that the cable was there, that it had not run away, nor been floated off by those undercurrents that exist in the imagination of some wise men of the sea, nor that it was so embedded in the ooze of the deep as to be beyond reach or recovery. All this was cheering, but as it promised to be a more difficult job than they had supposed, they were glad when the Great Eastern hove in sight that Sunday noon. The next morning Captain Moriarty and Mr. Temple came on board, and after reporting their experience, the chief officers of the expedition held a council of war before opening the campaign. The fleet was all together, the weather was favorable, and it was determined at once to proceed to business. As the attempt is now to be renewed on a grand scale, the reader may wish some further details of the means employed to ensure success. As nothing in this whole enterprise has excited such astonishment, nothing merits a more careful history. When it was first proposed to drag the bottom of the Atlantic for a cable lost in waters 2½ miles deep, the project was so daring that it seemed to be almost a war of the Titans upon the gods. Yet never was anything undertaken less in the spirit of reckless desperation. The cable was recovered, as a city is taken by siege, by slow approaches, and the sure and inevitable result of mathematical calculation. Every point was studied beforehand: the position of the broken end, the depth of the ocean, the length of rope needed to reach the bottom, and the strength required to lift the enormous weight. To find the place was a simple question of nautical astronomy, a calculation of latitude and longitude. It seemed providential that, when the cable broke on the 2nd of August, 1865, it was a few minutes after noon. The sun was shining brightly, and they had just taken a perfect observation. This made it much easier to go back to the place again. The waters were very deep, but that they could touch bottom and even grapple the cable was proved by the experiments the year before. But could any power be applied which should lift it without breaking and bring it safely on board? This was a simple question of mechanics. Professor Thomson had made a calculation that in raising the cable from a depth of 2½ miles, there would be about 10 miles of its length suspended in the water. Of course, it was a very nice matter to graduate the strain so as not to break the cable. For this it had been suggested that 2 or 3 ships should grapple it at once, and lifting it together, ease the strain at any one point, a method of meeting the danger that was finally adopted with success. With such preparations, let us see how all this science and seamanship and engineering are applied. The ships are now all together in the middle of the Atlantic. The first point is achieved. They have found the place where the broken cable lies. They have laid their hands on the bottom of the ocean and felt of it, and know that it is there. The next thing is to draw a line over it, to mark its course, for in fogs and dark nights it cannot be traced by observations. The watery line is therefore marked by a series of buoys a few miles apart, which are held in position by heavy mushroom anchors, let down to the bottom by a huge buoy rope, which is fastened to the top by a heavy chain. Each buoy is numbered, and has on the top a long staff with a flag and a black ball over it, which can be seen at a distance. Thus the ships, ranging around in a circuit of many miles, can keep in sight this chain of sentinels. The buoy which marks the spot where they wish to grapple has also a lantern placed upon it at night, which gleams afar upon the ocean. Having thus fixed their bearings, the Great Eastern stands off, north or south according to the wind or current, 3 or 4 miles from where the cable lies, and then, casting over the grapnel, drifts slowly down upon the line, as ships going into action reef their sails and drift under the enemy's guns. The fishing tackle is on a gigantic scale. The hooks, or grapnels, are huge weapons armed with teeth, like titanic harpoons to be plunged into this submarine monster. The fishing line is a rope 6½ inches round and made of twisted hemp and iron, consisting of 49 galvanized wires, each bound with manila, the whole capable of bearing a strain of 30 tons. Of this heavy rope there are 20 miles on board the ships, the Albany carrying 5, and the Great Eastern and the Medway 7½ miles each. Of course, it is not the easiest thing in the world to handle such a rope, but it is paid out by machinery, passing over a drum, and the engine works so smoothly that it runs out as easily as ever a fisherman's line was reeled off into the sea. As it goes out freely, the strain increases every moment. The rope is so ponderous that the weight mounts up very fast, so that by the time it is 2,000 fathoms down, the strain is equal to 6 or 7 tons. The tension, of course, is very great, and not unattended with danger. What if the rope should break? If it should snap on board, it would go into the sea like a cannon shot. Such was the tension on the long line, that once when the splice between the grapnel rope and the buoy rope drew, the end passed along the wheels with terrific velocity, and flying in the air over the bow, plunged into the sea. But the rope is well made, and holds firmly an enormous weight. It takes about 2 hours for the grapnel to reach the bottom, but they can tell when it strikes. The strain eases up, and then, as the ship drifts, it is easy to see that it is not dragging through the water, but over the ground. "I often went to the bow," says Mr. Field, "and sat on the rope, and could tell by the quiver that the grapnel was dragging on the bottom 2 miles under us." And thus, with its fishing line set, the great ship moves slowly down over where the cable lies. As the grapnel drags on the bottom, one of the engineer's staff stands at the dynamometer to watch for the moment of increasing strain. A few hours pass, and the index rises to 8, 10, or 12 tons, sure token that there is something at the end of the line. It may be the lost cable, or a sunken mast or spar, the fragment of a wreck that went down in a storm that swept the Atlantic 100 years ago. And now the engine is set in motion to haul in. As the rope comes up, it passes over a 5-foot drum, every revolution bringing up 3 fathoms. Thus it takes some hours to haul in over 2 miles length, perhaps at last to find nothing at the end. Success in hooking the cable depends on the accuracy of their observations. These were sometimes verified in a remarkable manner. When the nights were very dark and thick with fog, so that they could not see the stars above, nor their lights on the ocean, they had to go almost by the sense of feeling. Yet so exactly had they taken their bearings that they could almost grope over the ground with their hands. A singular proof of this was given one night, when just as the line began to quiver, showing that the cable had been hooked, one of the buoys, which had not been seen in the darkness, thumped against the side of the ship. So exactly had it been placed over the prescribed line that the ship struck the buoy just as the grapnel struck the cable. The accident, which startled them at first, when it occurred in the gloom of night, furnished the strongest proof of the accuracy of their observations, and the officers were very proud of it, as they well might be, as a victory in nautical astronomy. These different experiments revealed some secrets of the ocean. Its bottom proved to be generally ooze, a soft slime. When the rope went down, 1 or 2 hundred fathoms at the end would trail on the sea floor, and when it came up this was found coated with mud, very fine and soft like putty, and full of minute shells. But it was not all ooze at the bottom of the sea, even on this telegraphic plateau. There were hidden rocks, perhaps not cliffs and ledges, but at least scattered boulders, lying on that mighty plain. Sometimes the strain on the dynamometer would suddenly go up 3 or 4 tons, and then back again, as if the grapnel had been caught and broken away. Once it came up with 2 of its hooks bent, as if it had come in contact with a huge rock. At one time it brought up in the mud a small stone half the size of an almond, and another a fragment as large as a brick. This was a piece of granite. Friday, August 17th, was a memorable day in the expedition, for the cable was not only caught, but brought to the surface, where it was in full sight of the whole ship, and yet finally escaped. The day before the line had been cast over at about 2 o'clock, and struck the ground a little before 5. After dragging a couple of hours, the increasing strain showed that they had grappled the prize, and they began to haul in, but soon ceased and held on till morning. Then the engine was set in motion again, and slowly but steadily the ponderous rope came up from the deep. By half past 10 o'clock, Friday morning, 2,300 fathoms had come on board, and but 15 or 20 remained. Then was the critical moment, and they paused before giving a last pull. Such was the eagerness of all, that the diver of the ship, Clark, begged to be allowed to plunge down 20 fathoms to lay his hand on the prize and be sure that it was there. But patience yet a few minutes. A few more strokes of the engine, and the sea serpent shows himself, a long black snake with a white belly. "On the appearance of the cable," says Deane in his diary of the expedition, "we were all struck with the fact that one half of it was covered with ooze, staining it a muddy white, while the other half was in just the state in which it left the tank, with its tarred surface and strands unchanged, which showed that it lay in the sand only half embedded. The strain on the cable gave it a twist, and it looked as if it had been painted spirally black and white. This disposes of the oft-repeated assertion that we should not be able to pull it up from the bottom, because it would be embedded in the ooze." The appearance of the cable woke a tremendous hurrah from all on board. They cheered as English sailors are apt to cheer when the flag of an enemy is struck in battle, but their exultation came too soon. The strain on the cable was already mounting up to a dangerous point. Captain Anderson and Mr. Canning were standing on the bow, and saw that the strands were going. They hastened men to its relief, but it was too late. Before they could put stoppers on it to hold it, it broke close to the grapnel and sunk to the bottom. It had been in sight but just 5 minutes, and was gone. Instantly the feeling of exultation was turned to one of disappointment, and almost of rage, at the treacherous monster that lifted up its snaky head from the sea as if to mock its captors, and instantly dived to the silence and darkness below. It was a cruel disappointment, yet when they came to think soberly, there was no cause for despair, but rather for new confidence and hope. They had proved what they could, but this detained them in the middle of the Atlantic for 2 weeks more. It were idle to relate all the attempts of those 2 weeks. Every day brought its excitement. Whenever the grapnel caught, there was a suspense of many hours till it was brought on board. Several times they seemed on the point of success. 2 days after that fatal Friday, on Sunday, August 19th, they caught the cable again, and brought it up within 1,000 fathoms of the ship, and buoyed it. But Monday and Tuesday were too rough to work, and all their labor was in vain. Thus it was a constant battle with the elements. Sometimes the wind blew fiercely and drove them off their course. Sometimes the buoys broke adrift and had to be pursued and taken. Once or twice the boatswain's mate, a brave fellow by the name of Thornton, was lowered in ropes over the bow of the ship and let down astride of a buoy, and though it spun round with him like a top and his life was in danger, he held on and fastened a chain to it, by which it was swung on board. The continued bad weather was the chief obstacle to success. Engineers had often grappled for cables in the North Sea and the Mediterranean, but there they could look for at least a few days when the sea would be at rest. But in the Atlantic it was impossible to calculate on good weather for 24 hours. For nearly 4 weeks that they were at sea, they had hardly 4 days of clear sunshine without wind. Often the ocean was covered with a driving mist, and the ships groping about like blind giants, kept blowing their shrill fog trumpets or firing guns as signals to their companions that they were still there. Occasionally the sun shone out from the clouds and gave them hope of better success. Once or twice we find in the private journal kept by Mr. Field that it was too calm. There was not wind enough to drift the ship over the cable, so that the rope hung up and down from the bow without dragging. One Sunday night, he remembered, when the deep was hushed to a Sabbath stillness, the moon was shining brightly, and the ships floating over a sea of glass, that suggested thoughts of a better world than this. Such times gave them fresh hopes that might be disappointed on the morrow. Once, however, the Albany, which had been off a few miles fishing on its own hook, suddenly appeared in the night, reporting a victory. All on board the Great Eastern were startled by the firing of guns. It was a little after midnight, and Mr. Field had gone below, worn out with the long suspense and anxiety, when Captain Anderson came rushing to his stateroom with tidings that the cable was recovered. Both hurried on deck, and sure enough there was the Albany bearing down upon them, with her crew cheering in the wildest manner. The gallant Temple had conquered at last, but the next morning brought a fresh disappointment. They had indeed got hold of the cable, and brought its end on board, and afterward buoyed it, but when the Great Eastern went for it, it proved to be only a fragment some 2 miles long, which had been broken off in one of the previous grapplings. However, they hauled it in, and kept it with pride as their first trophy from the sea. And so the days and weeks wore on. It was near the end of August, and still the prize was not taken. The courage of the men did not fail, but they were becoming worn out. The tension on their nerves of this long suspense was terrible. On Tuesday, August 28th, Mr. Temple was brought on board from the Albany, very ill. He was worn out with constant watching. Their resources, too, must in time be exhausted. On the evening of the 29th, Captain Commerill, of the Terrible, came on board and reported the condition of his ship. He was one of the very best officers in the fleet, full of zeal, courage, and activity, having a good right hand in his first officer, Mr. Curtis, and always kept up a brave heart, even in the darkest days. Footnote A. Captain Anderson, in a letter published after the return to England, says: "Every officer and man of the expedition will have pleasant recollection of the cheerful zeal of Captain Commerill, V.C., and the officers of Her Majesty's ship Terrible. Captain Commerill frequently visited us in his boats, both in high seas and in calms, and his cheery way of saying, 'You'll do it yet. What can I do? And I'll do it,' was truly characteristic of him. The officers of the Terrible would do anything for their captain, and entered heartily into the object of the voyage." Such a tribute from one brave commander to another is most honorable to both. In the same letter he recognizes also the services rendered by the captains of the other ships. "I shall do but scant justice to Commanders Prowse and Batt, R.N., and Captains Eddington and Harris, Mercantile Marine, of the Medway and Albany, if I recall the 3 weeks spent upon the grappling ground, where we were often separated by fog, gale, or darkness, yet whenever day dawned or the fog cleared, there the squadron were to be seen, converging from different points toward the Mark Buoy, a small spot looking no bigger than a man's hat on the surface of the ocean. Unless all had concentrated their minds and watched their ships and compasses night and day, no such beautiful illustration of nautical science could have been possible. The vessels of the squadron keeping always together, and commanded by men who knew the importance of keeping close enough to begin work whenever it was possible, and yet to avoid collision in fog, was of the greatest importance, and we owe much to that invaluable system of signalling by night and day, invented by Captain Cullum, R.N., which enabled us, even in dark nights, when 2 or 3 miles apart, to communicate or ascertain anything we desired. End footnote. But his supplies were nearly exhausted. He had been out 4 weeks, and his coal was almost gone, and his men were on half rations, so he must leave the fishing ground for fresh supplies. It was a painful necessity. He mourned his fate like a brave officer who is ordered away in the midst of a battle, but he submitted only with the determination to take in ammunition, and to come back in a few days to renew the struggle. Accordingly the Terrible left the same evening for St. John's. End of Chapter 17, Part 1. Recorded by Alex C. Talander, www.bookbanter.net. Part 2 of Chapter 17 of the Story of the Atlantic Telegraph. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Atlantic Telegraph by Henry M. Field. Chapter 17. Recovery of the Lost Cable. Part 2. At the same time it was decided that the 3 other ships should leave their present cruising ground and try a new spot. As an old fisherman who has cast his line in one place so often as to scare the fish away sometimes has better luck in other waters, so they proposed to go east 100 miles to a place where the ocean was not quite so deep. Dean in his diary calls it the 1,600 fathom patch, but they found it 1,900 fathoms, or about 2 miles. So the next morning the Great Eastern, the Medway, and the Albany pulled up stakes. That is, they took in their buoys and bore away to the east. In a few hours they reached the appointed rendezvous, and had set their buoys. The last day of August had come, and all seemed favorable for a final attempt. It was a clear day with no wind. The sea had gone down, so that at noon it was a dead calm, as the 3 ships took their position in line, about 2 miles apart, ready to open their broadsides at once. The grapnel went over for the 30th time. Kind Heaven favored its search, and at 10 minutes before midnight it had found the cable, and fastened its teeth never to let go. Feeling something at the end of the rope, they began to haul in, but slowly at first, as an expert angler decoys a big fish by pulling gently on the line. Watching the dynamometer, they saw with delight the strain increase with every 100 fathoms. Up it went to 8, 9, 10 tons. They had caught it, and no mistake. In about 5 hours they had drawn it up to within 1,000 fathoms of the top of the water, where it hung suspended from the ship. But now came the critical point, for as it approached the surface, the danger of breaking increased every moment. It required delicate handling. To make sure this time, the Great Eastern buoyed the cable and moved off 2 or 3 miles to take a fresh gripe in a new place, and having got a double hold, the Medway, which was 2 miles further to the west, was ordered to grapple for it also, and having caught it, to heave up with all force, till she should bring it on board or break it. This was done, and the old cable brought up within 300 fathoms, and there broken. This at once lightened the strain, and gave them an end to pull upon. Whereupon the Great Eastern, having a lighter weight on the rope, drew up again, but still gently, watching the strain lest the cable should break. These operations were very slow, and lasted many weary hours. It was a little before midnight on Friday night that the cable was caught, and it was after midnight Sunday morning that it was brought on board. How long that day seemed! Night turned to morning, and morning to noon, and noon to night again, and still the work was not done, still the great ship hung over the spot where its treasure was suspended in the deep. The sun went down, and the moon looked forth from driving clouds upon a scene such as the ocean never saw before. At a distance could be discerned the black hulls of the attendant ships, the Albany and the Medway. But why were they thus silent and motionless in the midst of the sea? Some mysterious errand brought them here, and as their boats approached with measured sweep, at this midnight hour, it seemed as if they came with muffled oars to an ocean burial. It was still calm, but the sea began to moan with unrest, as if troubled in its sleep. As midnight drew on, the interest gathered about the bows of the Great Eastern. The bulwarks were crowded with anxious watchers peering into the darkness below. Still not a word was spoken. Not a voice was heard, save that of Captain Anderson or Mr. Halpin or Mr. Canning giving orders. As it approached the surface, two men who were tried hands were lashed with ropes and lowered over the bows, to make fast to the cable where it should appear. This was a perilous service, and the boats were there to pick up the brave fellows if they should drop it into the water. As soon as it showed itself, they dived upon it, and seizing it with their hands, fastened it with large hempen stoppers, which were quickly attached to 5-inch ropes. It was then found that the bight was so firmly caught in the springs of the grapnel that one of the brave hands who put on the stoppers was sent lower down to the grapnel, and with hammer and marline spike the rope was ultimately freed from the tenacious gripe of the flukes. The signal being given to haul up, the western end of the bight was cut with a saw, and grandly and majestically the cable rose up the frowning bows of the Great Eastern, slowly passing round the sheave at the bow, and then over the wheels on to the fore part of the deck. The greatest possible care had to be taken by Mr. Canning and his assistants to secure the cable by putting on stoppers, and to watch the progress of the grapnel, rope, and shackles round the drum before it received the cable itself. When once it was made fast, all took a long breath. The cable was recovered. They had the sea serpent at last. There the monster lay, its neck firmly in their gripe, and its black head lying on the deck. But even then there was no cheering, as when they caught it 2 weeks before. Men are sometimes stunned by a sudden success, and hardly know if it be not all a dream. So now they looked at the cable with eager eyes, but without a word, and some crept toward it to take it in their hands, to be sure that they were not deceived. Yes, it was the same that they had paid out into the sea 13 months before. But their anxiety was not over. Now that they had regained the lost cable of 1865, was it good for anything? It had been lying more than a year at the bottom of the deep. What if it should prove to have been broken somewhere in the 1,100 miles between the ship and Ireland? What if some sharp rock had worn it away, or some marine insect had eaten into its heart? If there were but a pin's point anywhere in its covering of flesh, the vital current might escape through it into the sea. Fears like these restrained their exultation. It was yet too soon to proclaim their victory. So, as the cable was passed along the deck to the testing room, where the chief electrician was to operate upon it, to see whether it was alive or dead, it was followed by an anxious group, who stood around him as he sat down at the instrument, watching his countenance as friends watch the face of a physician, where he feels the pulse of a patient to see if the heart is still beating. The scene is thus described by Mr. Robert Dudley, the artist of the expedition, whose spirited sketches in the London Illustrated News have made known to the world many incidents of this memorable voyage. I made my way with others, in accordance with an invitation from Willoughby Smith, to the electrician's room. Here, after another hour's preparation, during which time the cable had been carefully passed round the drums of the picking-up machinery, and a sufficient length drawn in on board, the severed end was received. And now, in their mysterious darkened haunt, the wizards are ready to work their spells upon the tamed lightning. Not unholy spells are these, or secret, for though the wizard's den is but of limited dimensions, they had not been averse to the presence of a few visitors. Mr. Gooch is looking on. Professor Thompson, be sure, is here, a worthy wizard of the North. Cyrus Field could no more be absent than the cable itself, I think. Canning, hard at work as he is forward in the ship, must have dropped in just for a moment. Clifford Laws, Captain Hamilton, Dean Dudley, All have in their several ways a great interest in every movement of Willoughby Smith and his brother and able assistant Oliver, and when the core of the cable is stripped and the heart itself, the conducting wire, fixed in the instrument, and these two electricians bend over the galvanometer, impatient watching for some message from that far-off land of home to which the great news has just been signalled, then the accustomed stillness of the test-room is deepened, the ticking of the chronometer becomes monotonous, nearly a quarter of an hour has passed, and still no sign. Suddenly Willoughby Smith's hat is off, and the British hurrahs burst from his lips, echoed by all on board with a volley of cheers, evidently none the worse for having been bottled up during the last 3 hours. Along the deck outside, over the ship, throughout the ship, the pent-up enthusiasm overflowed, and even before the test-room was cleared, the roaring bravos of our guns drowned the huzzas of the crew, and the whiz of rockets was heard rushing high into the clear morning sky to greet our consort ships with the glad intelligence. While this scene is going on board ship, we may turn to the other end of the line. It may be well supposed that the result of this attempt was watched with deep interest at Valentia. How they looked for the first signal from the deep, and how the tidings came, is thus told in the London Spectator. Night and day for a whole year an electrician has always been on duty, watching the tiny ray of light through which signals are given, and twice every day the whole length of wire, 1,240 miles, has been tested for conductivity and insulation. The object of observing the ray of light was of course not any expectation of a message, but simply to keep an accurate record of the condition of the wire. Sometimes, indeed, wild, incoherent messages from the deep did come, but these were merely the results of magnetic storms and earth currents, which deflected the galvanometer rapidly, and spelt the most extraordinary words and sometimes even sentences of nonsense. Suddenly, last Sunday morning, at 5:45, while the light was being watched by Mr. May, (Footnote B). This is an error. Mr. Crocker, an operator in the telegraph house of Valentia, was the fortunate one on watch at that hour, on whose eye the first ray fell, as a spark of life from the dead. End footnote. He observed a peculiar indication about it, which showed at once to his experienced eye that a message was at hand. In a few minutes afterward the unsteady flickering was changed to coherency, if we may use such a term, and at once the cable began to speak, to transmit, that is, at regular intervals, the appointed signals which indicated human purpose and method at the other end, instead of the hurried signs, broken speech, and inarticulate cries of the illiterate Atlantic. After the long interval in which it had brought us nothing but the moody and often delirious mutterings of the sea, stammering over its alphabet in vain, the words "canning to glass" must have seemed like the first rational word uttered by a high-fevered patient when the ravings have ceased and his consciousness returns. The telegraphic fleet remained together but a few hours after this recovery of the lost cable. The battle was gained, and the three ships were no longer needed. The Albany therefore parted company to pick up the buoys, and at once sailed for England, while the Great Eastern, attended by the faithful Medway, turned to the west. It was about 9 o'clock that the ships began to pay out the cable. Up to that time it had continued a calm, but the morning was raw and chill, and the sea began to rise as if in anger at those who had torn it from its prey. Captain Anderson looked anxiously at the signs of the coming storm. It seemed as if Heaven had kept back the winds during the critical day and night when they were lifting the cable. But now the tempest was upon them, and for 36 hours it swept the ocean. All trembled lest they should not be able to hold on. But little incidents sometimes turn the current of one's thoughts, and give a feeling of peace, even in the midst of anxiety. Says Mr. Field: "In the very height and fury of the gale, as I sat in the electrician's room, a flash of light came up from the deep, which, having crossed to Ireland, came back to me in mid-ocean, telling that those so dear to me, whom I had left on the banks of the Hudson, were well, and following us with their wishes and their prayers. This was like a whisper of God from the sea, bidding me keep heart and hope. The Great Eastern bore herself proudly through the storm, as if she knew that the vital cord which was to join two hemispheres hung at her stern, and so on Saturday, the 7th of September, we brought our second cable safely to the shore." The scene at Heart's Content, when the fleet appeared the second time, was one that beggars description. Its arrival was not unexpected, for the success on Sunday morning that had been telegraphed to Ireland was at once flashed across the Atlantic, and the people were watching for its coming. As the ships came up the harbor it was covered with boats, and all were wild with excitement, and when the big shore end was got out of the Medway and dragged to land, the sailors hugged it and almost kissed it in their extravagance of joy, and no sooner was it safely landed than they seized Mr. Field, Mr. Canning, and Mr. Clifford in their arms, and raised them over their heads, while the crowd cheered with tumultuous enthusiasm. The voyage of the Great Eastern was ended. Twice had she been victorious over the sea. Twice had she laid the spoils of victory on the shores of the New World, and her mission was accomplished. All on board, who had been detained weeks beyond the expected time, were impatient to return, and accordingly she prepared to sail the very next day on her homeward voyage. The Medway, which had on board the cable for the Gulf of St. Lawrence, remained 2 or 3 weeks longer, and with the Terrible, whose gallant officers had volunteered for the service, successfully accomplished that work. But the Great Eastern was bound for England, and Mr. Field had now to part from his friends on board. It was a trying moment. Rejoiced as he was at the successful termination of the voyage, yet when he came to leave the ship, where he had spent so many anxious days and weeks both this year and the years before, and to part from men to whom he was bound by the strong ties that unite those embarked in a common enterprise, brave companions in arms, he could not repress a feeling of sadness. It was with deep emotion that Captain Anderson took him by the hand as he said, "The time is come that we must part." As he went over the side of the ship, the commander cried, "Give him 3 cheers, and now 3 more for his family." The ringing hurrahs of that gallant crew were the last sounds he heard as he sunk back in the boat that took him to the Medway, while the wheels of the Great Eastern began to move, and the noble ship with her noble company bore away to England. Our story is told. We have followed the history of the Atlantic Telegraph from the beginning to the end, from the hour that the idea first occurred to its projector, turning over the globe in his library, till the cable was stretched from continent to continent. Between these 2 points of time many years have passed, and many struggles intervened. Never did an enterprise pass through more vicissitudes, never was courage tried by more reverses and disappointments, the constant repetition of which gives to this narrative an almost painful interest. Yet that background of disaster only sets in brighter relief the spirit that bore up under all, the faith that never despaired, and the patience that was never weary. It was a pathetic as well as heroic story which Mr. Field had to tell when it was all over. He said: "It has been a long, hard struggle, nearly 13 years of anxious watching and ceaseless toil. Often my heart has been ready to sink. Many times, when wandering in the forests of Newfoundland, in the pelting rain, or on the deck of ships, on dark stormy nights, alone, far from home, I have almost accused myself of madness and folly to sacrifice the peace of my family and all the hopes of life, for what might prove after all but a dream. I have seen my companions one after another falling by my side, and feared that I too might not live to see the end. And yet one hope has led me on, and I have prayed that I might not taste of death till this work was accomplished. That prayer is answered, and now beyond all acknowledgments to men is the feeling of gratitude to Almighty God." Footnote C: Speech at the Chamber of Commerce dinner, November 15th, 1866. End footnote. Long and hard, indeed, had been the way, but in the end what a triumph was gained, an achievement that was one of the most marvelous in all history, as a proof of man's dominion over the forces of nature. When it was first proposed to span the Atlantic, it seemed but a beautiful dream, fascinating indeed to the imagination, but beyond all human power, and men listened to the picture of what might be with delighted amazement and wondering incredulity. In an oration at the opening of the Dudley Observatory at Albany in 1857, Edward Everett spoke thus of the projected Atlantic Telegraph: "I hold in my hand a portion of the identical electrical cable, given me by my friend Mr. Peabody, which is now in progress of manufacture to connect America with Europe. Does it seem all but incredible to you that intelligence should travel for 2,000 miles along those slender copper wires, far down into the all but fathomless Atlantic, never before penetrated by aught pertaining to humanity, save when some foundering vessel has plunged with her hapless company to the eternal silence and darkness of the abyss? Does it seem, I say, all but a miracle of art, that the thoughts of living men, the thoughts that we think up here on the earth's surface, in the cheerful light of day, about the markets and the exchanges, and the seasons and the elections, and the treaties and the wars, and all the fond nothings of daily life, should clothe themselves with elemental sparks, and shoot with fiery speed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, from hemisphere to hemisphere, far down among the uncouth monsters that wallow in the nether seas, along the wrecked paved floor, through the oozy dungeons of the rayless deep, that the latest intelligence of the crops, whose dancing tassels will, in a few months, be coquetting with the west wind on those boundless prairies, should go flashing along the slimy decks of old sunken galleons, which have been rotting for ages, that messages of friendship and love, from warm living bosom, should burn over the cold green bones of men and women, whose hearts, once as warm as ours, burst as the eternal gulfs closed and roared over them centuries ago. But a few years passed, and the vision became a reality. The heart of the world beat under the sea. End of chapter 17. Recorded by Alex C. Telander. www.bookbanter.net. Chapter 18 of The Story of the Atlantic Telegraph. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Atlantic Telegraph by Henry M. Field. Chapter 18. The Afterglow. It is the clear shining after rain. The storms that swept the sea have blown themselves out, and all is tranquil on the face of the deep. The cable is lying in its ocean bed, uniting the two hemispheres, never more to be separated. And now comes the public recognition on both sides of the Atlantic, though in different form. The event had produced a profound impression throughout the civilized world, yet it was a singular illustration of the changes in public interest that, whereas in 1858 a temporary success had kindled the wildest enthusiasm in the United States, while in England it was regarded almost with indifference, now the state of feeling in the two countries was completely reversed. In Great Britain it was the theme of boundless congratulation, while in America the public mind, dulled perhaps by the excitements of 4 years of war, received the news with composure. The reason was in part that England had had a larger share in the later than in the earlier expeditions. Certainly none could deny the inestimable services rendered by her men of science, her seamen, her engineers, and her great capitalists, and it was most fit that the country which they had honored should do them honor in its turn. Scarcely had the Great Eastern recrossed the sea before those to whom the empire owed so much were duly recognized in the following letter from the Earl of Derby, then Prime Minister, addressed to Sir Stafford Northcote, who was to preside at a dinner given in Liverpool to celebrate the great achievement. Balmoral, Saturday, September 29th, 1866. Dear Sir Stafford, as I understand you are to have the honour of taking the chair at the entertainment which is to be given on Monday next in Liverpool to celebrate the double success which has attended the great undertaking of laying the cable of 1866 and recovering that of 1865, by which the two continents of Europe and America are happily connected, I am commanded by the Queen to make known to you, and through you to those over whom you are to preside, the deep interest with which Her Majesty has regarded the progress of this noble work, and to tender Her Majesty's cordial congratulations to all of those whose energy and perseverance, whose skill and science have triumphed over all difficulties, and accomplished a success alike honourable to themselves and to their country, and beneficial to the world at large. Her Majesty, desirous of testifying her sense of the various merits which have been displayed in this great enterprise, has commanded me to submit to her, for special marks of her royal favour, the names of those who, having had assigned to them prominent positions, may be considered as representing the different departments, whose united labours have contributed to the final result, and Her Majesty has accordingly been pleased to direct that the honour of knighthood should be conferred upon Captain Anderson, the able and zealous commander of the Great Eastern, Professor Thomson, whose distinguished science has been brought to bear with eminent success upon the improvement of submarine telegraphy, and on Messrs. Glass and Canning, the manager and engineer respectively of the Telegraph Maintenance Company, whose skill and experience have mainly contributed to the admirable construction and successful laying of the cable. Her Majesty is further pleased to mark her approval of the public spirit and energy of the two companies who have had successfully the conduct of the undertaking, by offering the dignity of a baronetcy of the United Kingdom to Mr. Lamson, the deputy chairman of the original company, to whose resolute support of the project, in spite of all discouragements, it was in a great measure owing that it was not at one time abandoned in despair, and to Mr. Gooch, M.P., the chairman of the company, which has finally completed the design. If among the names thus submitted to and approved by Her Majesty, that of Mr. Cyrus Field does not appear, the omission must not be attributed to any disregard of the eminent services which, from the first, he has rendered to the cause of transatlantic telegraphy, and the zeal and resolution with which he has adhered to the prosecution of his object, but to an apprehension lest it might appear to encroach on the province of his own government, if Her Majesty were advised to offer a citizen of the United States, for a service rendered unlike to both countries, British marks of honour, which, following the example of another highly distinguished citizen, he might feel himself unable to accept. The reason assigned by Lord Derby for the omission of Mr. Field's name in the distribution of honours was perfectly understood and entirely satisfactory. The British Government had once before offered a baronetcy to Mr. George Peabody in recognition of his princely benefactions to the poor of London, but while he appreciated the honour, he felt that as a citizen of the United States he could not accept it, and the same reason would apply in the present case. But while this alone prevented official recognition, it could not prevent the hearty expression of Englishmen who knew the history of the great enterprise from the beginning. At this very dinner the chairman gave, as the first toast, the original projectors of the Atlantic cable, which he proposed early in order to give Mr. Cyrus Field, who was very near to them, although he happened to be in America, a chance of responding. The illusion is explained by the remark of one present who had said, "You will be pleased to hear that Mr. Bright has kindly brought the telegraph wire into the room in which we are sitting, and no sooner will the toast involving the mention of Mr. Field's name be given from the chair, than it will be flashed with lightning speed to Valentia, thence to Newfoundland, and if Mr. Field is at home, it is quite possible that he himself will receive it ere the echo of your ringing cheers has died away in Liverpool." A message was at once sent from the room to Newfoundland, and a reply received back that Mr. Field had left for New York. In continuing his speech, Sir Stafford Northcote said, "I think there can be no doubt in the minds of those who have carefully examined the history of these transactions, that it is Mr. Cyrus Field that we owe the practical carrying out of the idea which has borne such glorious fruit. I am sure there is none to whom we owe more, or whose name stands in prouder connection with this great undertaking, than the name of Mr. Cyrus Field." He called upon Sir Charles Bright to reply, who detailed somewhat the history of the enterprise from the very beginning in 1856, when "Mr. Cyrus Field, to whom the world was more indebted than to any other person for the establishment of the line, came to England upon the completion of the telegraph between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland." To the same effect is the testimony of a distinguished writer, W. H. Russell, LL.D., who was on board of the Great Eastern in 1865 as the correspondent of the Times, and wrote a very graphic history of the expedition. "It has been said that the greatest boons conferred on mankind have been due to men of one idea. If the laying of the Atlantic cable be among those benefits, its consummation may certainly be attributed to the man who, having many ideas, devoted himself to work out one idea with a gentle force and patient vigor, which converted opposition and overcame indifference. Mr. Field may be likened either to the core or the external protection of the cable itself. At times he has been its active life, again he has been its iron-bound guardian. Yet who will claim the merit of having first said the Atlantic cable was possible? To Mr. Field is due the inalienable merit of having made it possible, and of giving to an abortive conception all the attributes of healthy existence." Sir William Thomson, the following triumph, wrote, "My dear Field, I cannot refrain from putting down in black and white my hearty congratulations on your great success. Few know better than I do how well you deserve it." 8 months after he wrote from Scotland, "I am sorry I had not an opportunity of saying in public how much I value your energy and perseverance in carrying through the great enterprise, and how clearly you stand out in its history as its originator and its mainspring from beginning to end." Next to Sir William Thomson was Mr. C. F. Varley, who was associated with the work from an early day, and did much to solve the difficult problems of ocean telegraphy, and who wrote to Mr. Field, speaking from his personal knowledge, "You did more than any other to float the concern, and single-handed saved the whole scheme from collapse more than once." Captain Sir James Anderson repeated the same conviction in numberless forms. He had seen how the perseverance of Mr. Field in London instantly revived the languid enthusiasm of others, and infused his own energy into the enterprise, and declared again and again that but for these heroic and incessant efforts the whole scheme would have broken down and been delayed for many years. Such expressions from English associates in the great work might be multiplied to any extent. They are much stronger than any language used by the author of this volume, who has purposely kept back such testimonies, lest it should seem that he wished to exalt an individual when he sought to do justice to all on both sides of the Atlantic. Nor was such recognition confined to England. The King of Italy conferred on Mr. Field the Cross of the Order of St. Mauritius, as an acknowledgment from the country of Columbus to one who had done so much to unite to the Old World that New World which Columbus discovered. A still higher honor was paid by the Great Exposition in Paris in 1867, which, gathering the products of the genius and skill and industry of all nations, recognized the labors of men of all countries, who, by their discoveries or great enterprises, had rendered eminent services to the cause of civilization. It awarded the grand prize, the highest distinction it had to bestow, to Mr. Field by name, jointly with the Anglo-American and Atlantic Telegraph Companies, thus recognizing, as was most due, the splendid exhibition of the science and the capital of England, which were never more directly employed for the benefits of the human race than in the uniting of the two hemispheres, while it gave the first place in the grand design to its American leader. But to an American no praise is so dear as that which comes from his own countrymen. First of all to Mr. Field was that which came from the faithful few who had stood by him and witnessed his exertions for 12 long years. At the first annual meeting of the stockholders of the New York, Newfoundland, and London Telegraph Company, the following resolution was, on motion of Mr. Moses Taylor, seconded by Mr. Wilson G. Hunt, unanimously adopted: Whereas this company was the first ever formed for the establishment of an Atlantic Telegraph, an enterprise upon which it started in the beginning of 1854, at the instance of Mr. Cyrus W. Field, and which, through his wise and unwearied energy, acting upon this company and others afterwards formed in connection with it, has been successfully accomplished. Therefore the stockholders of this company, at this their first meeting since the completion of the enterprise, desiring to testify their sense of Mr. Field's services, resolve, first, that to him more than any other man the world is indebted for this magnificent instrument of good, and but for him it would not, in all probability, be now in existence. Second, that the thanks of the stockholders of this company are hereby given to Mr. Field for these services, which, though so great in themselves, and so valuable to this company, were rendered without any remuneration, and, third, that a copy of this resolution, certified by the chairman and secretary of this meeting, be delivered to Mr. Field as a recognition, by those who best know, of his just right to be always regarded as the first projector and most persistent and efficient promoter of the Atlantic Telegraph. Peter Cooper, Chairman; William G. Hunt, Secretary. To testify to the public appreciation of this great achievement, and of his part in it, the Chamber of Commerce of New York invited Mr. Field to a public banquet, which was given on the 15th of November. It was attended by about 300 gentlemen, not only merchants and bankers, but men of all professions, lawyers and judges, clergymen and presidents of colleges, members of the government and foreign ministers, and officers of the army and navy. The President of the Chamber of Commerce, Mr. A. Lowe, presided, and, at the close of his opening speech, said: "We may fairly claim that from first to last Cyrus W. Field has been more closely identified with the Atlantic Telegraph than any other living man, and his name and his fame, which the Queen of Great Britain has justly left to the care of the American government and people, will be proudly cherished and gratefully honored. We are in daily use of the fruits of his labors, and it is meet that the men of commerce, of literature and of law, of science and art, of all the professions that impart dignity and worth to our nature, should come together and give a hearty, joyous, and generous welcome to this truly chivalrous son of America." He proposed the health of their guest. "Cyrus W. Field, the projector and mainspring of the Atlantic Telegraph, while the British government justly honors those who have taken part with him in this great work of the age, his fame belongs to us, and will be cherished and guarded by his countrymen." In his reply, Mr. Field told the story with the utmost simplicity, passing rapidly over the nearly 13 years through which the enterprise had struggled with such doubtful fortunes, and taken pains to do full justice to all who shared in its labors, its disappointments and its triumphs. Especially did he award the highest praise to the Government of England for its liberal and constant support, to her men of science and her great capitalists, and to the officers of ships, electricians, and engineers, who had taken part in this undertaking. In closing, he said: "Of the results of this enterprise, commercially and politically, it is for others to speak. To one effect only do I refer as the wish of my heart: that, as it brings us into closer relations with England, it may produce a better understanding between the two countries. Let who will speak against England, words of censure must come from other lips than mine. I have received too much kindness from Englishmen to join in this language. I have eaten of their bread and drunk of their cup, and I have received from them, in the darkest hours of this enterprise, words of cheer which I shall never forget. And if any words of mine can tend to peace and goodwill, they shall not be wanting. I beg my countrymen to remember the ties of kindred. Blood is thicker than water. America, with all her greatness, has come out of the loins of England, and though there have been sometimes family quarrels, bitter as family quarrels are apt to be, still in our hearts there is a yearning for the old home, the land of our fathers, and he is an enemy of his country and of the human race, who would stir up strife between two nations that are one in race, in language, and in religion. I close with this sentiment: England and America, clasping hands across the sea, may this firm grasp be a pledge of friendship to all generations." To which the whole assembly responded by rising, and by prolonged and tumultuous cheers. In the brilliant array of guests was recognized the tall form of General Meade, who was loudly called for as "the hero of Gettysburg," to which he replied that there was but one hero on this occasion, and he had traveled 100 miles to be there that night to do him honor. He said: "I have watched with eagerness the struggle through which he has passed, and the disasters which attended to his early efforts, and I have admired and applauded, from the bottom of my heart, the tenacity of purpose with which that man has continued to hold on to his original idea, with a firm faith to carry to completion one of the greatest works the world has ever seen." The heartiness of this soldierly reply was echoed by the bluff old warrior, Admiral Farragut, who had been so often through the smoke and flame of battle that he knew how to appreciate not only common courage, but the desperate tenacity which holds on in spite of disaster, that has gained many a victory. Letters were read from the President of the United States, from Chief Justice Chase, from General Grant, from Sir Frederick Bruce, the British Minister, from Senators Morgan and Sumner, from General Dix, Minister to France, and others. The Chief Justice of the United States wrote: "I am very sorry that I cannot leave Washington this week, and so cannot avail myself of your kind invitation to join you in congratulations to Mr. Field upon the success of his grand undertaking. It is the most wonderful achievement of civilization, and to his sagacity, patience, perseverance, and faith is civilization indebted for it. Such works entitle their authors to distinguished rank among public benefactors. You will write the name of your honored guest high upon that illustrious roll, and there it will remain in honor, while oceans divide and telegraphs unite mankind." There was a telegraph instrument in the room, and dispatches were received during the evening from Mr. Seward, Secretary of State, and other members of the Cabinet of Washington, from Lord Monck, Governor General of Canada, from the Governor of Newfoundland, and others. One from Captain Sir James Anderson was dated at London the same day. John Bright also wrote a dispatch and sent it to London, but by an oversight it was not forwarded. He afterward wrote a letter giving the message. It was as follows: "It is fitting you should honor the man to whom the whole world is debtor. He brought capital and science together to do his bidding, and Europe and America are forever united. I cannot sit at your table, but I can join you in doing honors to Cyrus W. Field. My hearty thanks to him may mingle with yours." He adds that he regarded what had been done as the most marvelous thing in human history, as the more marvelous than the invention of the art of printing, or, he was already to say, than the voyages of the Genoese, and of Mr. Field he says: "The world does not yet know what it owes to him, and this generation will never know it." About the same time in his speech at a great Reform meeting in Leeds, he bore this proud testimony: "A friend of mine, Cyrus Field, of New York, is the Columbus of our time, for after no less than 40 voyages across the Atlantic, in pursuit of the great aim of his life, he has at length, by his cable, moored the New World close alongside the Old." Nor was there mere rhetoric, a burst of extravagance to which an orator might give way in the excitement of a public occasion. It was a comparison which he repeated on many occasions, though slightly varied in expression. Mr. G. W. Smalley, the well known correspondent of the New York Tribune, in writing from London, on the very day that Mr. Field was carried to his grave, recalls how he heard it from Mr. Bright's own lips. He says: "The great orator spoke of the great American in terms which he did not bestow lavishly, and never bestowed carelessly. His respect for Mr. Field's public work was sufficiently shown in the splendid eulogy which he passed upon him. To be called by such a man as Mr. Bright the Columbus of the 19th century is renown enough for any man. The epithet is imperishable. It is, as Thackeray said of a similar tribute to Fielding and Gibbon, like having your name written on the dome of St. Peter's. The world knows it, and the world remembers. I heard Mr. Bright use the phrase, and he adorned and emphasized it in his noblest tones." America has no official honors to bestow, no knighthoods or baronetcies to confer. But one honor it has, the thanks of Congress, which, like the thanks of Parliament, is the more highly prized in that it is so rarely bestowed, being reserved generally for distinguished officers in the army and navy, like Generals Grant, Sherman, or Sheridan, or Admiral Farragut, who have won great victories. Yet such was the feeling on this occasion, that when Senator Morgan of New York moved a vote of thanks in the name of the country, it met with an immediate response. It was at once referred to the Committee on Foreign Relations, which reported unanimously in its favor, and when, some weeks after, giving time for due deliberation, it was brought up for action, it passed with entire unanimity. In the House of Representatives it was preceded by many bills, so that there was danger that it might not be reached before the end of the session. Yet on the very last day Speaker Colfax requested unanimous consent of the House to take it up out of its order, which was granted, and the resolution was then read 3 times and passed unanimously. It is as follows: "Resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that the thanks of Congress be, and they hereby are, presented to Cyrus W. Field of New York, for his foresight, courage, and determination in establishing telegraphic communication by means of the Atlantic cable, traversing mid-ocean and connecting the Old World with the New, and that the President of the United States be requested to cause a gold medal to be struck, with suitable emblems, devices, and inscriptions, to be presented to Mr. Field. And be it further resolved, that when the medal shall have been struck, the President shall cause a copy of this joint resolution to be engrossed on parchment, and shall transmit the same, together with the medal, to Mr. Field, to be presented to him in the name of the people of the United States of America. Approved March 2nd, 1867. Andrew Johnson." This action of Congress reached Mr. Field in England. As he was about returning to America, Lord Derby, still at the head of the government, addressed to him a letter in which he repeated what he had said before, "in the Queen's name." How much of the success of the great undertaking of laying the Atlantic cable was due to the energy and perseverance with which from the very first, in spite of all discouragements, you adhered to and supported the project, and adding, "Your signal services in carrying out this great undertaking have been already fully recognized by Congress, and it would have been very satisfactory to the Queen to have included your name among those on whom, in commemoration of this great event, Her Majesty was pleased to bestow British honors, if it had not been felt that, as a citizen of the United States, it would hardly have been competent to you to accept them. As long, however, as the telegraphic communication between the two continents lasts, your name cannot fail to be honorably associated with it." This surely was all that could be expected from the Government. But some there were in England who felt that there was still a debt of honor to be paid, which required some public testimonial. Accordingly, on Mr. Field's return to London in 1868, they prepared for him an imposing demonstration, in the form of a banquet, given at Willis's Rooms on the 1st of July, at which was assembled one of the most distinguished companies that ever met to do honor to a private citizen of any country. It embraced over 400 gentlemen of all ranks, ministers of state, members of Parliament, both Lords and Commons, officers of the army and navy, great capitalists, merchants and bankers, men of science and of letters, inventors, electricians and engineers, men eminent in every walk of life. The Duke of Argyll presided, and speeches were made by three members of the Government: Sir John Pakington, Secretary of State for War; Sir Stafford Northcote, Secretary of State for India; and Sir Alexander Milne, First Sea Lord of the Admiralty; by John Bright; by the Venerable Lord Stratford de Redcliffe, so long the British Minister at Constantinople; and by M. de Lesseps, the projector of the Suez Canal, who had come from Egypt expressly to be present. It was a tribute such as is rarely paid to any man while living, such tributes being reserved for the dead, and is still more honorable in this case, alike to the givers and the receiver, in that it was paid by the people of one country to a citizen of another, who is regarded in both as their common benefactor. But enough of praise that can fall only on the dull, cold ear of death. A few words on the after years of this busy life, and I have done. These years brought a rich reward for all the sacrifices of the past. The first feeling was one of infinite relief that at last the victory was won. The terrible strain was taken off, and to him who had been borne it so long, the change to the quiet of his own happy home was inexpressibly grateful after his many and long separations. He was now in his own country and under his own roof, but with a name that was known on both sides of the sea. The complete success of the Atlantic Telegraph had given him an immense reputation at home and abroad. It seemed as if the struggles of life were all over, leaving only its honors to be enjoyed. What more could he ask to make life worth living than the respect of his countrymen for his courage, energy, and perseverance, and a name honored all over the civilized world as one of the world's benefactors? The practical results of the cable were even greater than he had dared to anticipate. In the space of a few months it wrought a commercial revolution in America. It was a new sensation to have the Old World brought so near that it entered into one's daily life. Every morning, as Mr. Field went to his office, he found laid on his desk at 9 o'clock the quotations on the Royal Exchange at 12. Lombard Street and Wall Street talked with each other as two neighbors across the way. This soon made an end of the tribe of speculators who calculated on the fact that nobody knew at a particular moment of the state of the market on the other side of the sea, a universal ignorance by which they profited by getting the earliest advices. But now everybody got them as soon as they, for the news came with the rising of each day's sun, and the occupation of a class that did not much to demoralize trade on both sides of the ocean was gone. The same restoration of order was seen in the business of importations, which had been hitherto almost a matter of guesswork. A merchant who wished to buy silks in Lyons sent out his orders months in advance, and of course somewhat at random, not knowing how the market might turn, so that when the costly fabrics arrived he might find that he had ordered too many or too few. A China merchant sent his ship around the world for a cargo of tea, which returned after a year's absence, bringing not enough to supply the public demand, leaving him in vexation at the thought of what he might have made, if he had known, or, what was still worse, bringing twice too much, in which case the unsold half remained on his hands. This was a risk against which he had to be insured, as much as against fire or shipwreck, and the only insurance he could have was to take reprisals by an increased charge on his unfortunate customers. This double risk was now greatly reduced, if not entirely removed. The merchant need no longer send out orders a year beforehand, nor order a whole shipload of tea when he needed only 100 chests, since he could telegraph to his agent for what he wanted and no more. With this opportunity for getting the latest intelligence, the element of uncertainty was eliminated, and the importer no longer did business at a venture. Buying from time to time so as to take advantage of low markets, he was able to buy cheaper, and of course to sell cheaper. It would be a curious study to trace the effect of the cable upon the prices of all foreign goods. A New York merchant, who has been himself an importer for 40 years, tells me that the saving to the American people cannot be less than many millions every year. But the slender cord beneath the sea had finer uses than to be a reporter of markets, giving quotations of prices to counting rooms and banking houses. It was a link between hearts and homes on opposite sides of the ocean, bearing messages of life and death, of joy and sorrow, of hopes and fears. One of its happiest uses was the relief of anxiety. A ship sailed from England with hundreds of passengers, but did not arrive at her destination on the appointed day. Instantly 1,000 hearts were tortured with fear, lest their loved ones had gone to the bottom of the sea. When the cable reported that the delay was due simply to an accident to her machinery, that would keep her back for a day or two, but that the good ship was safe with all on board. What arithmetic can compute the value of a single message that relieves so much anguish? Thus the submarine telegraph stretched out its long arms into the sea to lay a friendly hand on two peoples and give assurance to both. Such a triumph of commercial enterprise was enough to satisfy the pride and ambition of any man. But it was not in Mr. Field's nature to rest content with any success, however great, and he was always reaching out for some new undertaking to give scope to his restless activity. Such an opportunity he found in giving rapid transit to New York, a city which, though it has one of the finest harbors in the world, with approaches from the sea that afford every possible advantage for commerce, is not so favorably situated landward, as it is built on a long and narrow island, between two broad rivers, which confines it on either side, so that it is stretched out to such distances that it is no easy matter to pass from one end to the other. From the Battery to the Harlem River is 10 miles, so that working men who live so far away were an hour or more in getting from their homes to their place of work, and as long as in getting back again, a large inroad upon their hours of rest or domestic comfort. The only means of transportation was by street cars, which moved slowly, and in winter, whenever the streets were blocked with snow, were crowded to suffocation, and dragged at a snail's pace to the upper end of the island. This was the great barrier to the city's growth, and must be removed if it was not to be stunted and dwarfed by these limitations. To furnish some relief, an elevated railroad built on stilts had been attempted on a small scale, but soon broke down, when Mr. Field bought the control of the whole concern and took it in his own strong arms. It was no easy matter to galvanize it into life, but though it had a charter, it was still obstructed in the legislature and in the courts, so that it was a long time before he could get full possession. But once master of the situation, he undertook the work on a grand scale, and pushed it with such vigor that in less than 2 years the road was in operation. It has since been extended with the public demand until now, in 1892, there are 36 miles of road, over which the trains sweep incessantly from the bay to the river, and from the river to the bay. The structures are not indeed the most graceful in the world, as they bestride the long avenues of the city, but these tall iron pillars that line our streets for miles are the long legs of civilization, and have a somewhat imposing effect as they stretch away into the distance, with the fire-drawn cars flying swiftly over them. Dean Stanley glorified them by a historical parallel which could occur only to one full of the wonders of ancient times, that started into life under the touch of his imagination. Going with him one day on an excursion, he stepped briskly, for his frame was so light as to offer little impediment to motion, and as he mounted the long stairway and stood on the platform above the crowded street below, he exclaimed, "This is Babylonian! 4 chariots driving abreast on the walls of the city!" But Babylonian or American, the success was enormous. As soon as the public became familiar with these elevated roads, and felt that they were safe as well as swift, the people swarmed upon them, in numbers constantly increasing, till now they carry over 700,000 passengers a day. On the day of the Columbus celebration it was 1,075,000. Indeed, if we are not staggered by numbers, we may sum up the whole in the amazing statement demonstrated by figures, that since these roads were opened, they have carried over 1,800 millions of passengers, more than the whole population of the globe. Nor should it be forgotten that, not only is the facility therefore the greatest, but the fares the lowest, for, thanks to Mr. Field, they were reduced years ago to 5 cents at all hours, and for the longest distance, the 10 miles from the Battery to the Harlem River. The effect was immediate in the appreciation of real estate in the city, the assessed value of which has already advanced by the sum of $500 millions. The increased taxation is enough to pay for all the cost, while as a relief to the congested parts of the city, and as furnishing a means for that easy circulation which is as necessary to a great city as a free circulation of the blood is to the human body. It is not too much to say that the construction of the elevated railroads is the greatest material benefit that has ever been conferred on the city of New York. But busy as Mr. Field was through all these years, much of his life was spread abroad. He had interests in both sides of the Atlantic, but stronger than his interests were his friendships to attract him across the sea. He had come to feel as much at home in England as in his own country, and his visits were so frequent that his sudden appearances and disappearances were a subject of amused comment to his English friends. When Dean Stanley was in America, a reception was given to him at the Century Club, where in a very happy address he referred to the ties between the two countries, among which was "the wonderful cable on which it is popularly believed in England that my friend and host, Mr. Cyrus Field, passes his mysterious existence, appearing and reappearing at one and the same moment in London and in New York." As Mr. Field was thus brought near to his English friends, they in turn were brought near to him, for as no man in America was better known abroad, no house received more foreign guests, many of whom he had not met before, but who brought letters to him, and there was no end to his hospitality. John Bright he could not persuade to cross the sea, but he had the pleasure to welcome his co-laborer in the repeal of the Corn Laws, Richard Cobden. The house in Gramercy Park became famous for its receptions. Many will recall that given to the Marquis of Ripon and the other High Commissioners, who came a year or so after the war as representatives of the British Government, and negotiated at Washington the treaty which settled the Alabama claims, and those to Dean Stanley and Archdeacon Farrar, and to many others. If the strangers happened to arrive in the summer time, they were entertained at his beautiful country seat on the Hudson, to which he had given the name of Ardsley, from the seat of John Field the astronomer, who lived in the West Riding of Yorkshire more than 3 centuries ago, and introduced the Copernican astronomy into England, and from whom the family are descended. In some cases, when he went abroad, England was but the starting point for excursions on the Continent, in which he visited almost every European country. In 1874, in company with 2 well-known Americans, Bayard Taylor and Murat Halstead, he made a voyage to Iceland, as 10 years before he had been to Egypt, as a delegate from the New York Chamber of Commerce, to witness the opening of the Suez Canal. In 1880 81, he took a still longer flight around the world, waiting till after the presidential election that he might cast his vote for his friend General Garfield. The very next day he left with his wife in a special car for San Francisco, where after a few days they took ship for Japan, from which they passed through the inland sea to Shanghai, and from China to Singapore, and up the Bay of Bengal to Calcutta, where he found the same English nobleman whom he had entertained in New York, the Marquis of Ripon, Governor General of India. Going up the country, the travellers visited Agra and Delhi, where the wonders of architecture showed the magnificence of the old Mogul Empire. The whole journey was one of infinite pleasure and instruction, and they were never weary of talking of the strange manners and customs of the people of Asia. When they returned to America, General Garfield was President of the United States, who, though a Western man by birth, had been educated in New England, at Williams College in Massachusetts, where he had been graduated 25 years before, and which he had a desire to revisit, and it was arranged that he should leave Washington in the morning of July 2nd, with as many of his cabinet as could be spared from the seat of government, and come on to New York and all be entertained at Ardsley, and the next day proceeded up the Hudson and across the country to Williamstown, a program which was interrupted by the terrible news that on arriving at the station in Washington he had been shot, an event that instantly recalled the assassination of Lincoln. At once there rose a cry of horror from one end of the land to the other, and for weeks the whole country was watching by the bedside of this illustrious sufferer. Of course, the sympathy for the wife and children was universal, but Mr. Field was the first to give this sympathy a practical direction. With his quick eye he saw the condition in which they would be left by the death of the President. As for them the law makes no provision. His salary stops at the very day and hour that he ceases to live, nor is there a pension settled upon his family, nor can anything be paid from the national treasury except by special act of Congress. In this extremity it occurred to Mr. Field that what the government failed to do should be made up by private generosity, and even before General Garfield's death he started a subscription, heading it with $5,000, and taking it in person to his rich friends. This self-imposed task occupied him several months, in which he raised a fund of over $360,000, which was put into United States 4% bonds, yielding an interest of over $12,000 a year, to be paid quarterly during the life of Mrs. Garfield, and then to go to her children. It was a great satisfaction to have thus provided for those who bore the name of a President of the United States, so that they should be able to live in the comfort and dignity that befitted the family of one who had occupied the most exalted station in the government. Not content with this, Mr. Field went to Washington and urged upon his friends in Congress, and finally succeeded in getting passed, a bill giving to the widows of all Presidents a pension of $5,000, which, it added to his gratification to know, would apply to the venerable Mrs. Polk, and that still goes, and will go during her lifetime, to the wife of General Grant, as a slight expression of a nation's gratitude. Next to the interest he felt in his own country, his heart was in England. While he was an intense American, and perhaps for that very reason, because he was an American, he claimed kindred with the people from whom we are not only descended, but have received such an inheritance of glory. In his own words, America, with all her greatness, has come out of the loins of England. When he was in India, he was proud of the mighty English race that from its little island governed an empire of 250 millions on the other side of the globe. Some might have said that he inherited no small portion of his unconquerable spirit. And not only did he admire Old England, but he loved Englishmen. He knew all that was said of English reserve and English pride, but long familiarity had taught him that underneath this cold exterior were many of the noblest qualities, courage, heroism, and fidelity, so that it had become a part of his creed that an Englishman, when once you have won his confidence, will go farther and fight harder for a friend or for a cause than any other man on the face of the earth. Among such a people Mr. Field was proud to number many of his dearest friends. A touching proof of their regard for him was given but a few months before his death. On the 2nd of December, 1890, he and his wife celebrated their golden wedding. For 50 years they had traveled on the course of life together. Children and grandchildren had been born to them, so that at the close of half a century a large and happy family was gathered round those to whom they looked up with the tenderest affection. Among the congratulations of that day was a large scroll, signed by Mr. Gladstone, the Duke of Argyll, Lord Monck, and some 80 others, whose names are widely known. It was a graceful tribute from England to a son of America, who had done perhaps more than any other living man to bring the two countries and the two peoples together. That golden wedding was the fit coronation of a life of wonderful activity, and all the kindred who met under that roof were grateful for the past and full of hopes for the future. But God's ways are not as our ways. Before many months the clouds began to gather. The next summer, when the family were all at their country home, sickness cast its shadow over their dwelling, which grew more grave till November 23rd, when the leaves were falling from the trees before their door, the mother of this large household breathed her last. 2 months later, the eldest daughter, who was also the eldest child of the family, followed. These repeated blows fell heavy in the affectionate heart of the bereaved husband and father, and when to these were added other sorrows still, it seemed as if the clouds were piled one upon another till they darkened all the horizon. The winter was a gloomy one, from its loneliness and its many causes of sadness. But with the returning spring the grass grew green again, and the trees put forth their leaves, and it seemed as if the new life of nature must put life into the heart of man. And when he removed to the country, and began to drive about as of an old among the familiar haunts, the beautiful scenery from a time delighted his eye, and the change of air brought a touch of the old spirit, as if perchance his strength were about to return. But it was only a momentary flush, and he soon took to his room, where, as he looked from his windows and saw the sun going down over the hills beyond the Hudson, it could only remind him that for him the sun of life was about to set forever. Fair was the world without, but desolate was the home within, since she who had made its brightness was gone. And here on the 12th of July, 1892, the end came. It was a beautiful morning, and the windows were open, through which the soft summer air floated into the chamber of death, where his 3 brothers, all that were left of his father's family, with those of his own household, were round his bed, and watching the dear pale face. Thus surrounded and beloved to the last, he ceased to breathe. 2 days later, a large company from the country round and from the city gathered at Ardsley, and stood on the lawn and the slopes that led up to the noble trees that shade the dwelling, as Bishop Potter read the blessed words, "I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live." The next day we bore him away from his home, and from the great city where he had passed his busy life, back to the quiet valley where he was born, and laid him down in the shadow of the encircling hills. Footnote A: The Berkshire Hills, Stockbridge, Massachusetts. End footnote. "Bury me there," he had said, "by the side of my beloved wife and by my father and mother." The earth closed over him, and all his struggles and his sorrows were buried in the grave. The man is gone, but the work remains, a work that multiplies itself, for when once the leader and explorer had opened the way, others were swift to follow, so that now there are no less than 10 cables stretched across the Atlantic, and every hour of day or night, when men wake and when they sleep, for even in the hours of silence the heart is still beating, only a little more slowly, the pulse of life is kept moving to and fro. The morning news comes after a night's repose, and we are wakened gently to the new day that has dawned upon the world. That which serves to such an end, which is a connecting link between countries and races of men, is not a mere material thing, an iron chain lying cold and dead in the icy depths of the Atlantic. It is a living, fleshly bond between severed portions of the human family, thrilling with life, along which every human impulse runs swift as the current in human veins, and will run forever. Free intercourse between nations, as between individuals, leads to mutual kindly offices, that make those who at once give and receive feel that they are not only neighbors but friends. Hence the mission of submarine telegraphy is to be the minister of peace. The first message across the deep was "Glory to God in the highest, peace on earth, good will to men," and the first news it brought was that of peace in China. And when again the sea had found a tongue, its first glad intelligence was that the great war between Austria and Prussia was ended. Thus, at its very birth, was this new messenger baptized in the name of peace, and consecrated to a service worthy of its name. Man marks the earth with ruin, his control stops with the shore; upon the watery plain the wrecks are all thy deed. Not all! The wrath of man adds to the fury of the elements. To strew the sea with wrecks is the work of lightning and tempest. Man's nobler office is to restore what nature may destroy. It was the chief desire of him who has gone to the grave that the link which unites England and America might bind the countries that he loved the most in indissoluble union. Though the two nations dwell apart, on opposite shores of the same great and wide sea, they are now brought almost within the sound of each other's voice and the touch of each other's hand. They can look into each other's eyes, and exchange their morning and evening congratulations with the rising and setting of each day's sun. May the instrument through which they look and speak never startle them with rude alarms, but continue to whisper peace in tones as gentle as the murmur of the sea, as long as the winds blow and the waters roll. End of Chapter 8. Recorded by Alex C. Talander, www.bookbanter.net. Appendix to The Story of the Atlantic Telegraph. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Atlantic Telegraph by Henry M. Field. Appendix. Instruments for signaling across the Atlantic Ocean. If the project of an Atlantic telegraph be justly ascribed to the daring of an American, and a success to his courage and perseverance through years of struggle and disappointment, the solution of the scientific problem involved in it is due to the genius of a Scotchman, whom the writer of this volume first knew, and it is a pleasant memory to have known such a man in the beginning of his splendid career, as Professor Thomson, of the University of Glasgow, where his father had been professor before him, whom the son succeeded in the department of physics, which included the then little known science of electricity, to which the young professor devoted himself with all the eagerness of scientific genius. The project of a telegraph across the ocean suggested new problems and new difficulties, to which he applied himself with characteristic ardor, the result of which is here given. When the second expedition of the Great Eastern, in 1866, was successful, the British government at once recognized his eminent services, and the name of Sir William Thomson has since been recognized among the leaders in scientific discovery, not only in England, but all over the scientific world. The government has recently added a further dignity in making him a peer of the realm, an honor hitherto reserved generally for the leaders of armies, like Wellington. To confer it on a simple professor shows an advance of civilization in the respect paid to the intellectual greatness. In conferring such a title, the government does not honor the man more than it honors itself. It is to the glory of England that such an honor should be paid to science in the person of Lord Kelvin, as was paid to literature in the person of Lord Tennyson. The following, taken in substance from an English scientific review, will indicate briefly but with sufficient clearness the problem to be solved in signaling to great distances under the sea, and the instruments by which this is accomplished. The speed of signaling through a submarine cable depends upon its electrostatic capacity, which, unless it be very small, gives rise to retardation. In the Proceedings of the Royal Society for 1855, Sir William Thomson showed how the effect at the distant end of a cable, caused by the application of a battery at one end, could be calculated and represented graphically in what is called the curve of arrival. After contact is first made at the sending end between the cable and one pole of the battery, the other pole being to earth, a certain interval of time elapses before any effect is felt at the distant end. This interval of time is denoted by the letter A. After the interval of time A has passed, a current begins to issue from the cable at the receiving end, and increases in strength very rapidly. After a further interval of 4A, or after a period of 5A from the first application of the battery, it attains about half its maximum strength, and there is very little sensible increase in strength after time equal to 10A has elapsed. The curve of arrival is drawn by taking distances along OX to represent intervals of time, and distances along OY to represent strengths of current. Curve number 1 shows the gradual increase in strength of the received current at one end of a cable when the battery is applied to and kept in contact with the other end. For a distance corresponding to the interval of time A, the curve does not sensibly deviate from the straight line OX. In other words, no effect is observable at the receiving end during this time. If now, instead of being continuously applied to the battery at the sending end, the cable had been applied to it during a short interval of time, and then disconnected from the battery and connected to earth, the curve of arrival would be of the form shown by curve number 2. Curve number 2 shows the effect of applying the battery during a length of time equal to 4a, and then putting the cable to earth. It will be seen that a current gradually diminishes in strength, continues to flow out of the cable at the distant end for a considerable time after the battery has been disconnected. This continued discharge is what gives rise to the difficulty experienced in reading the signals sent through long cables. The instrument first used for receiving signals through a long submarine cable, the short-lived 1858 Atlantic cable, was the mirror galvanometer, which consisted of a small mirror with 4 light magnets attached to its back, weighing in all less than half a grain, suspended by means of a single silk fibre in a proper position within the hollow of a bobbin of fine wire, a suitable controlling magnet being placed adjacent to the apparatus. The action of this instrument is as follows. On the passage of a current of electricity through the fine wire coil, the suspended magnets with the mirror attached tend to take up a position at right angles to the plane of the coil, and are deflected to one side or the other according as the current is in one direction or the other. Of various other forms of receiving instruments devised by Sir William Thomson, the next to be noticed is the spark recorder, both on account of the principles involved in its construction, and because it in some respects foreshadowed the more perfect instrument, the siphon recorder, which he introduced some years later. The action of the spark recorder was as follows. An indicator, suitably supported, was caused to take a to and fro motion by means of the electromagnetic action due to the electric currents constituting the signals. This indicator was connected to a Ruhmkorff coil or other equivalent apparatus, designed to cause a continuous succession of sparks to pass between the indicator and a metal plate situated beneath it, and having a plane surface parallel to its line of motion. Over the surface of this plate and between it and the indicator there was passed, at a regularly uniform speed in a direction perpendicular to the line of motion of the indicator, a material capable of being acted on physically by the sparks, either through their chemical action, their heat, or their perforating force. The record of the signals given by this instrument was an undulating line of fine perforations or spots, and the character and succession of the undulations were used to interpret the signals desired to be sent. The latest form of receiving instrument for long submarine cables is that of the siphon recorder, for which Sir William Thomson obtained his first patent in 1867. Within the 3 succeeding years he effected great improvements on it, and the instrument has, since that date, been exclusively employed in working most of the more important submarine cables of the world. Indeed, all except those on which the mirror galvanometer method is still in use. In the siphon recorder, a view of which is shown in Figure 1, the indicator consists of a light rectangular signal coil of fine wire, suspended between the poles of a powerful electromagnet, so as to be free to move about its longer axis, which is vertical, and so joined up that the electrical currents constituting the signals through the cable pass through it. A fine glass siphon tube is suitably suspended, so as to have only 1 degree of freedom to move, and is connected to the signal coil so as to move with it. The short leg of the siphon tube dips into an insulated ink bottle, which permits of the ink contained by it being electrified, while the long leg is situated so that its open end is at a very small distance from a brass table, placed with its surface parallel to the plane in which the mouth of this leg moves, and over which a slip of paper may be passed at a uniform rate as in the spark recorder. The effect of electrifying the ink is to cause it to be projected in very minute drops from the open end of the siphon tube towards the brass table, or on the paper slip passing over it. Thus, when the signal coil moves in obedience to the electric signal currents pass through it, the motion then communicated to the siphon is recorded on the moving slip of paper by a wavy line of ink marks very close together. The interpretation of the signals is according to the Morse code, the dot and dash being represented by deflections of the line to one side or the other of the center line of the paper. Perfect as this instrument seemed, yet after further years of study and experiment, Sir William Thomson was able, at the close of 1883, to present to the world the siphon recorder, greatly improved because in a very much simpler form. In this form of the instrument, instead of the electromagnets, he used 2 bundles of long bar magnets of square section, and made up of square bars of glass hard steel. The 2 bundles are supported vertically on a cast iron socket, and on the upper end of each is fitted a soft iron shoe, so shaped as to concentrate the lines of force, and thus produce a strong magnetic field in the space within which the signal coil is suspended. He made instruments of this kind to work both with and without electrification of the ink. Without electrification, the instrument, as shown in Figure 2, is exceedingly simple and compact, and in this form is capable of doing good work on cables of lengths up to 500 or 600 miles. When constructed for electrification of the ink, as shown in Fig. 3, it is of course available for much longer lengths of cable, but for cables such as the Atlantic cables, the original form of the siphon recorder is still chiefly used. The strongest magnetic field hitherto obtained by permanent magnets of glass hard steel is about 3,000 C.G.S. With the electromagnets of the original form of siphon recorder, as in ordinary use, a magnetic field of about or over 500 C.G.S. is easily attained. In Fig. 4, it shows a facsimile of part of the message received and recorded by a siphon recorder, such as shown in Fig. 1 from one of the Eastern Telegraph Company's cables of about 830 miles length. End of the story of the Atlantic Telegraph, by Henry M. Field. Recorded by Alex C. Telander. www.bookbanter.net